This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 10, and just looking at some of the stories that we may discuss today, it occurred to me that two of them, they don't play into each other at all, but they could be viewed alongside each other. Jeremy Hunt is poised to raise the national living wage to £11 an hour. And, of course, the other story about shoplifters being treated like fraud, or shoplifting to be treated like fraud and corruption by a new police unit. And the question of what's happening at the moment, how much should staff do in shops to prevent shoplifting? And I can't help wondering whether there's something fundamentally wrong about the idea of people on £11 an hour being required to risk their personal safety to protect goods on behalf of a company that's probably posting profits well into seven figures. I hadn't spotted that little link before, but we may address it further in later in the programme, because I want to begin with this. Is there a German word for taking no pleasure whatsoever in being proved right? There should be, shouldn't there? You know how Schadenfreude is taking pleasure from other people's misfortune. It was best expressed, I think, by the American writer Gore Vidal, who said, where he expressed the opposite of it, actually. He said, whenever a friend of mine succeeds, a part of me dies. I mean, it's quite a public school thing to say that, actually, that sort of notion of permanent competition. You just look at people like Johnson and Cameron and you understand it. Thankfully, I'm here to tell you, you can grow out of it. But I don't know if you ever grow out of deriving no pleasure whatsoever from being proved right about stuff. Whether it is, I don't know, the weird new TV stations springing up that it's pretty obvious to predict where they're heading, or Brexit itself, or politicians, or pronouncements. But it actually makes my heart sink to reflect upon how often I've told you over the last 2 years or more that if you are long-term sick, or if you are unable to commit to what you might describe as the 9 to 5 because of your health, they are coming for you next. I wish it was wrong. I wish I hadn't. I'm not going to wish I hadn't said it, because forewarned is forearmed. But when you just get the hang of this business of prediction or of forecasting, when you get the hang of it, it's actually, don't tell anyone I told you this, because I don't want to boast my way out of a job, but it's actually very easy. You just get the tactics first, and then you'll get the detail of it. So that Brussels was going to be, but we've got to hurt them. We've got to, they're terrible. They're dragging us back, when they actually weren't, of course. But that was a great narrative, which got Johnson into Downing Street and got Brexit over the line. Immigrants are doing us terrible harm, terrible, terrible harm. Of course, they're not. But it's a wonderful scapegoating exercise to explain suboptimal experiences among ordinary voting people who think their lives should be somehow better. Here is a foreign person recently arrived on these shores, and they are to blame for your salary or your housing situation. It's all their fault. Absolutely nothing to do with the people who've been in charge for 13 years. And then you combine Brexit with immigration, and you are told you're about to take back control of your borders, and you end up living in a country where the numbers are largely through necessity, largely through economic necessity, the numbers are higher than they've ever been before. So who will they go after next? Well, they've tried to go after the woke mob, but spoiler alert, there's no such thing. That's the great flaw in the attempt to portray the woke mob as the latest constituency holding you back from a better existence. There's no such thing as the woke mob. There is no homogenous group of individuals and or institutions that are working together, working in conjunction with each other to, I don't know what they are supposed to be doing, to slow the country down. What did Liz Truss try to call it? The anti-growth coalition. Probably the most bonkers episode of recent British political history was not even the economic illiteracy that they deployed in Downing Street, but the way they sought to blame it. This astonishing, we've run out of scapegoats, so we need a new scapegoat. How about the wokerati? How about the tofu-eating wokerati? The mind boggles, frankly, but it doesn't exist. So when you've understood how it works, and when you have remembered or listed the attempted receptacles of blame that have already come in for a kicking, you are left with the inevitable conclusion that it will be the long-term sick that goes next. They can't really go after the jobless anymore because the universal credit has rendered that existence to be pretty close to the breadline, if not below it. Simultaneously, you need to be reminded that about 40% of people on universal credit are actually in work. So you can't demonise everybody on universal credit because almost half of them have already got a job. You'll also be aware of attempts to claim that people are faking their illnesses or are on the lam. And, of course, there's an appalling demeaning of mental health, which is best understood as telling somebody with a broken leg that they should run for a bus. That's what telling somebody with mental health issues that they should just, pull their socks up and get to work is the equivalent of that. That's a nice word. You see, the problem is, Ash, you've sent me a German word now. But I don't know. I'll have to check it during the break, won't I? Because otherwise you could have me saying swear words on the radio. You could have me saying German swears on the radio. So I say, is there a German word for taking no pleasure whatsoever in being proved right? And you send me a German word, and I say it on the radio very glibly with a silly smile on my face, and then it turns out I've just insulted your grandmother or accused her of some form of promiscuity. I'm not going to read out German words without double-checking what they might mean. But there is no pleasure whatsoever in being proved right about this. About 100,000 people are understood to be in Mr. Hunt's sights, reports the Daily Telegraph, rubbing its thighs with glee. He will argue today that it is unfair for benefits claimants who are not trying to get a job to receive the same financial support as those who do. Leaving aside the relatively negligible status of that number and the pitiful amounts of money that people receive today, I just balk at the bleakness. It's about 5.2 million people out of work. Hasn't come back down after the pandemic. In percentage terms, it's still gratifyingly low. And there are, of course, huge job vacancies in the market as well. But I don't want to come at this from predictable political positions. I want to come at it from two angles. Can we? Well, possibly three. When I first started doing this job, one of the things that surprised me most was the lack of rigour that was applied to evidence for things that people wanted to believe. So if you wanted to believe that everybody on what we used to call the dole was somehow taking the mickey, the evidence that was offered up for this was pitiful. It would be pretty close to, there's a bloke over the road, right, who is married to someone whose brother knows a girl who never goes to work and she takes home £5 million a week in benefits. And everyone would just lap it up. George Osborne spoke at one point about people whose curtains are closed. So you get up for work, right, in the morning, the bloke over the road, his curtains are closed. So you go, yeah. You sort of, I found myself thinking, well, possibly he's on a night shift. I'm not surprised his curtains are closed. He only went to bed half an hour ago. He's just got in after working all night as a hospital porter or working in a warehouse or stocking up the supermarket so that when you turn up to shop at opening time, the shelves are actually full. Who do you think does it? Elves and pixies? Of course his curtains are. But that idea of, it's a very Tory thing to do, isn't it? To just sort of not quite invent, but embellish and exaggerate and create an air that everybody else is taking, that where the harder you work, the more everybody else is taking the mickey. So it would be nice to know how many people you might reasonably include in the category of those who are choosing to live on the relative pittance that you would get on an unemployment benefit. Because, in my opinion, they need help and, I don't want to say pity, but I mean, imagine having such reduced horizons that you would do this as a lifestyle choice. And so unlikely is that to me that I can't believe there's a significant number of people doing it. But the key question, as ever, when we turn our attention to these sort of issues, the key question is from both sides of the interview room, both sides of the interview desk, both sides of the job application process. It is, how hard is it to fill vacancies at the moment, and how hard is it to find work? 12 minutes after 10 is the time. If you know that, this is what I want to pin down as well. Among this so-called 100,000 that he's going after, my fear is that there are a lot of people who would like to work and can't. No, there are a lot of people who would like to work but aren't, because they can't, because employers don't want to take someone on that cannot actually guarantee they'll be available 5 days a week because of physical or mental ailments. And yet, if you could find an employer who could deploy a little bit of flexibility, you would love nothing more than to be earning a little bit more of a crust than you currently are. So I'd like to talk, and also I did also tell you that this was going to happen, kind of brushing long COVID-related issues under the carpet as well. I think that has to be. It has to be, doesn't it? Part of the reason for the fact that the unemployment figures haven't dropped back after we came out of the pandemic. An awful lot of people who gave up work during the pandemic would like to go back, but they no longer feel fit or capable of doing so. And if you're already, this is the bit that terrifies me, and this is where I need your help, actually. You're not in work at the moment, all right? What are you living on? 0345 6060 973. What are you living on? And then we'll get an idea of how likely it is that the threat of having to live on less would somehow propel you to find work that you're currently turning your nose up at. So I've gone around the houses a bit on this introduction, but it's because there's so much under the bonnet, isn't there, of a so-called policy like this. What do you think is the most important element of what I've just said? It's probably the last bit, isn't it? Probably this idea that so what are you currently living on? You are not in work. You are living on unemployment benefit, right? Or whatever you call it this week. You are living on that. And Jeremy Hunt thinks that if he threatens you with having to live on less, then you will go and get a job. So I need to know what you're currently living on and why. The why, of course, then explains why you're not currently in work. And then your response to the idea that if he threatened you with even less money to live on, you would then somehow discover an appetite for work that you currently lack. Yeah, that is it, isn't it? So we got there in the end, because you need to pinpoint the sense of cruelty here. With a side order of plausibility, maybe there are loads of people who are really living it up at taxpayers' expense, and who, with the threat of not being able to live it up quite as uproariously as they currently are, they would be compelled to find a job. But I just don't believe that they exist on anything like the scale that the government and their friends in the media argue. And that's the question that we need to get to the bottom of. So this story frightens you because it targets you. You're not working, right? What are you getting by on at the moment? 0345 6060 973. And how do you feel about the idea that threatening you with even less to live on is what is needed to get you into a job that you don't currently think you can do? 0345 6060 973. And then, so that the rest of us can get involved, challenge my bleakness if you want. Please tell me that I'm, and I don't mean this in a glib way. I think it's healthy for us all to have our views properly examined. But this is, you could file a lot of what I've just said under bleeding heart bubble dweller or some such. But I don't think I am, because, the key question of what you're currently living on and the threat of making you live on less being what would propel you out of the front door in the morning and into work, I just don't think it's plausible. If you do, the number you need is 0345 6060 973. And if you don't, then, well, you tell me what you think the government are doing and whether you think it will work. Because I don't know. I remember when I told you they'd go after the long-term sick next, or they'd go after people who a sort of mythical constituency of people who need even tougher sanctions in order to get them to work. I just don't know that it will work anymore. Something seems to have changed, but I could, of course, be wrong.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 10 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's the crassness of it, isn't it? That sort of sticks in your craw. Just what's Jeremy Hunt going to announce today? He's going to announce a clampdown on benefits claimants. God, what year is it? How long have they? And also, if they need to announce a clampdown on benefits claimants, then surely that means that their last clampdown on benefits claimants wasn't the success that they claimed their last clampdown on benefits claimants was. You can't keep claiming that you've clamped down successfully on benefits claimants and then waiting a couple of years and announcing that now you need another clamp down on benefits claimants. It's just bizarre. 20 minutes after 10, but I want to examine the reality of it. The reality really of your existence, your experience and your reaction to the idea that the Chancellor thinks you're swinging the lead. David's in Bristol. David, what would you like to say?
Oh, sorry. Hello. I've been listening to your radio this morning, and I am a 43-year-old male with chronic, incurable conditions. I was medically retired by my doctor 3 years ago, but I am in receipt of various benefits, including lower working rate allowance, which means I don't have to look for work and I don't have to engage in work. But without a job, I have no value. So I force myself
no value
to work.
To whom?
No value to me, and I'm a single dad as well. Right. So it's important that I keep going. I feel pressured to keep going because I'm on benefits. I work 6 hours a week for a supermarket, which is pretty much all I can do, and that wipes me out for 5 days, which means I can't parent, I can't do anything else. And the prospect of someone telling me that I have to do more than that when I'm medically retired. I mean, first of all, I don't want to alarm you unduly. I don't know whether you would fall into the category of. You probably wouldn't, would you? Is there joined up thinking between the DWP and the NHS on this one? If your doctor medically retires you, then surely that's something that the DWP just absorbs and accepts. Well, no, not actually. I've just spent 2.5 years battling the DWP to last week, having them accept my personal independence application.
Okay.
But they also, on the same day, sent me a review form saying we want to fully review it. Now, I know that my health conditions fluctuate, so I've just been granted personal independence payment, and they're already looking to revoke it before I've had my first payment.
On what? How does that work? Is it because they think you're getting better, or they think you didn't deserve it in the first place?
They review it periodically. My award was for 3 years initially, which I contested. So obviously we've been 2.5 years. I still haven't had a single payment from them. It's just been acknowledged that they are going from 0 points to going pretty much full point via tribunal. I haven't even had a payment from them, and they're already saying, we're going to reassess you. Now, my health is not what it was 2.5 years ago, but it could go back that way if I push myself too hard.
Yeah. There's nothing in place, is there, for people who want to work but need their conditions accommodating? That seems to me to be the simplest lesson to learn from all of this. And a lesson that Jeremy Hunt today seems to be willfully ignoring.
Absolutely. There's no support for people like me. I feel ashamed that I'm on benefits, that I can't work.
I wish you wouldn't, because you worked all your life. You worked until you were, 40 or so. You paid and your parents paid in expectation of people being looked after when they needed to be looked after.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's a bit disconcerting to hear that, the most vulnerable are being targeted again, but it's not something new. But yeah, the DWP and the NHS unfortunately don't
talk to each other at all, which is something that cabinet ministers could actually address. You've got the person that runs or nominally is at the head of the DWP or whatever they call it this week, and you've got the person who is nominally the head of the NHS, and you've got the person who is nominally the head of the Treasury. You've got the two Secretary of States and the Chancellor of the Exchequer all sitting around the same table every day. Are they going to talk about the kind of stuff that seems obvious to David, and I suspect to you listening as well? No, of course they're not. They're going to talk about why we need to clamp down on them. 25 minutes after 10 is the time. I listen. When David says that it looks like they are targeting society's most vulnerable, I really cannot stress enough how welcome it would be if you wanted to challenge that. If you are the person to whom Jeremy Hunt is appealing, and you find it perfectly reasonable and plausible that this constituency of people should be addressed. I won't even say targeted, because from where I'm sitting, I'm with David. It does feel like they're going after the the most vulnerable members of our society. It's why they all keep talking about hard-working families. I don't know if you remember, that was a great piece by Nesri Malik, hard-working families, to which I often respond by thinking, won't somebody speak of those of us who are just, phoning it in every day? 10:25 is the time. Stephen's in Truro in Cornwall. Stephen, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, hi, James. The call has really resonated with me because I'm currently out of work, and I've been out of work since I was medically discharged from the Navy in 2014.
Gosh.
And I've had ongoing mental health problems related to PTSD from various parts of time in the Navy.
I'm sure.
And these comments by Jeremy Hunt this morning, and in general, because you hear it all the time, feed into a sense of worthlessness and shame, like the last caller was saying. Because it's a constant battle. I feel that it's almost like an imposter syndrome. Like I'm not sick enough.
Yeah.
To be worthy of,
because it's invisible.
Of benefits. It's completely invisible. Yeah, there's no crutch. There's no
sure.
cast like you have on a broken leg.
How much of that comes from without, and how much of it comes from within? I know it's pretty hard to separate the two, but how much is internal shame and how much is external disapproval? Sort of people who you feel are judging you.
Sure, you never hear it to your face.
No.
Until
it's Tory conference season.
and then people talk in generalisations about
Yes.
it, and you immediately feel that's me they're talking about.
So here's a generalisation.
To.
Tell me if this has this. So, but since the pandemic, he'll say later today, things have been going in the wrong direction. While companies struggle to find workers, around 100,000 people are leaving the labour force every year for a life on benefits.
Yeah, as if it's a choice.
Yeah. Well, he thinks it is. He clearly thinks it is. For 100,000 people. He may not include you in that category, but the language makes you feel judged.
It's absolutely not a choice. And any reference to it being some kind of choice or lifestyle choice is completely wrong. You just get a sense that people do judge you in that way, and they may not say it to your face, but when it comes out in public comments and people talking in interviews and on television about it, and you just think that's me they're talking about, that's me they're referring to every time.
I don't know how you avoid that conclusion, whether it is sort of statistically true or not. It's about tone, isn't it, and language, as you say. The idea that life on benefits is easy is completely insane as well. I mean, it was a massive pay cut for me leaving the forces and having to live on benefit. I couldn't maintain the mortgage payments on my house. I lost my house. Me and my family we rent now. That's our only option. Our lifestyle completely changed. I think that is the most insidious element of all of it, isn't it? Where does that come from? And I want to be completely honest with me. Before you left the Navy, before you became ill, how susceptible were you to the rhetoric that everyone unemployed is really living it up at our expense?
I guess I'm an outlier here because my dad left the forces also with mental health problems and was on benefits. So
you knew the reality of it a little more than perhaps.
He was a pilot in the RAF and was med discharged late into his career, and then lived on benefits subsequently. So I had that life experience as well. So
you could set the reality against the rhetoric.
But if he was here, I could put him on the phone and he would tell you exactly the same way I feel about it, and we talk about it a lot.
I'm sure you do. It must be a great comfort to both of you, Stephen, that we do such a good job in this country of, and I quote, looking after our own. End quote.
I mean, the charity support for veterans is second to none. I won't
No, but it shouldn't be charity. It shouldn't be charity.
It shouldn't be charity.
I've done quite a lot of work over the years with Combat Stress, who do amazing work in precisely the field that you're describing. I haven't done much lately, actually, but the weirdest thing about involvement with organisations like that is the simultaneous, it's almost a dissonance, a cognitive dissonance. This is absolutely brilliant and important and amazing, but it shouldn't have to exist at all. Stephen, thank you. Touched on a lot of points there, which people are welcome to pick up on, but through me. And I apologise that once again, the people governing this country are making you, as someone who should be much, much better looked after, feel shame and guilt for the situation in which you find yourself. Convince me that it's not deliberate on 0345 6060 973. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:34, and it's a grim old business, but at least we can keep each other's company as we navigate our way through the latest swamps of Tory policy. On this occasion, 100,000 people a year. I don't think this statistic is right. I've noticed Jonathan Portes of King's College tweeting about it as well. I think he's just spoken to one of our colleagues on LBC News. We may join them in availing ourselves of his expertise, because this line about 100,000 people, it's in Jeremy Hunt's speech. Do you know, I think one year we picked up, because they give the speech to the newspapers before they give the speech. And one year, I'm sure they changed it after we noticed something in it. Can anyone remember who that was? It may not even have been the Tories. I'm sure that we went in hard on something they'd given to the newspapers saying they were going to say. And whether it was because we went in so hard or not, they then didn't actually say it. But he is currently due to say that 100,000 people a year are leaving the labour force for a life on benefits. And that's just not true. Or at least, if he's suggesting it's a lifestyle choice, then that's not true. 10:35 is the time, unless you think it is, in which case you know the number. Rose is in Portsmouth. Rose, what would you like to say?
Well, what I'd like to say is you don't get a life on benefits. It isn't a life. It's an existence on benefits. I worked from when I was 16 until I was 61 and then became ill. I have chronic kidney disease and I have a heart condition which would normally require open heart surgery. I'm not fit enough to have that. Oh. So chances are I will end up, shuttling off the mortal coil. But before I do, what I would like to say is I would love to see these guys give me a budget. They're so good at budgets. Give me a budget for the £801 I live on per month, I exist on per month. If somebody had told me 20 years ago that I would need to go, I didn't even know what a food bank was 20 years ago. Never even heard of it. Do you know what I mean? It sounds like something that you're doing, I don't know, in Russia or somewhere. Yeah. But here we are, here. And we've got people going to food banks and we're taking that as norm, and it shouldn't be right. And all this business about who goes off to live on benefits, nobody does. Nobody does.
I'm really sorry about the situation in which you find yourself, and I know you don't want anybody's pity, but you'll allow me to offer my sympathy, my heartfelt sympathy.
Thank you.
No, that's, and I know I speak for pretty much everybody listening to the programme when I say that. But where do they get this idea from? I'm not sure it was ever true.
I don't know. It's never been true. I just think this is, like you say, they're just spinning this to make it excusable for why we've got so many. They can't admit the fact that, look, how dreadful is this? We've got people going to food banks. We've got children that are having going to share coats.
There was a million. We did it on Friday, actually, Rose. 1 million children who haven't got a bed of their own. They're either sharing with siblings or parents or sleeping on the floor. And yet Jeremy Hunt thinks 100,000 people a year are looking at their wages and thinking, I'll be better off on £801 a month. Interrupt me, will you, please?
Yeah, sorry. You said Jeremy Hunt thinks. Look, Jeremy Hunt doesn't think. I swear to God, where does this guy come from? He went into the NHS. Yeah. He made a complete hash of that, shuffled off and let someone else take the blame. Now he's going to do this, and by the time he gets around to it really having an impact, please, God, let there be a Labour government. Please, God, let there be a Labour government. But he'll be able to shuffle off, and that won't be his fault. I have never known such a snide in all my life. I wouldn't have him work for me, would you?
I'm glad you're getting this off. I'm glad you're getting this off your chest, Rose.
I am.
I'm happy to help.
I've never phoned you before, I'm so glad that I'm just letting all this go.
Well, good.
Truly.
That's what we're here for. Some days. That's exactly what we're here for. What? Can I go back to the money? Do you mind?
Yeah, of course. No, of course.
How does that break? So of your outgo, you've got. That's all that's coming in, and everything that's going out has to come out of that £801.
Yes, absolutely. So out of that 801, they do pay a part of my rent. I will say that.
Right.
I get part of my rent paid, but out of that £801, I need to pay £200 towards my rent.
Right.
Okay. I need to pay my council tax, my electricity, all the normal household bills. And that's broken up of £404, which is called a PIP payment, which you only get if you're disabled.
So if you weren't disabled, what would you be getting?
Oh, I don't know. Nothing, probably. I don't. Well, it certainly wouldn't be that. I think it would just be the amount I get from Universal Credit, which is the remaining £400.
And half of that would go on your rent straight away, and they wonder why you can't get out of the...
Exactly. Well, my rent for this property, it's a housing association property. I've not owned a property.
Right.
This is a housing association property, and my rent, if I didn't get that £200, would be £420 a month.
Which would wipe you out, really, before you'd even got out of bed in the morning.
Absolutely.
What,
and listen, if he can find me a job I can do, I'll happily. Perhaps I could come and do his PR for him.
Yes, I mean, I sense that you'd never run out of things to say, Rose, which is half the battle when it comes. It's half the battle when it comes to PR.
I'd make it up as I go along. That seems to be what they do.
They've got plenty of people doing that already, Rose. You need to come up with a unique selling point, and that wouldn't be one of them. And then you look at the question I always ask people, and I sense probably as with the previous caller, it won't work with you. But were you ever susceptible to this rhetoric when things were going better for you?
You know, to my shame, James, I kind of was. And I'm so ashamed of that. When I look back to the person I was, I don't know, even 10 years ago, I think before the whole Brexit thing, and I know you don't like mentioning that, but before that, I was kind of a bit of a different person. You know, I kind of thought, it doesn't matter who you vote for, the government to get in. I didn't really take part in anything because my life was okay. Now, that sounds selfish, but I put my hands up and admit that. You know, I'd go along and I'd buy a charity raffle ticket every now and again and think that brought me, you know. And then suddenly I found myself in a position, I mean, I don't know anybody else in my family who's been in this position, so I'd never had any direct experience of it. But my God, when you find yourself in it, it is terrifying. I'm terrified of this conference. I'm scared of what they're going to say. I just, you know, and all joking aside, I try and keep upbeat about everything, but all joking aside, I just think they can't cut us back anymore. Well,
that is that. There it is. There it is. You absolutely nailed it. Where is this going to come from? This extra slice. Where is it going to come from? And of course, the conversation simultaneously addresses tax cuts for businesses as well. So we go after Rose and our other callers today for pennies, but when it comes to businesses and donors, well, we need to actually help them increase their income. 1041 is the time, because that's how growth happens, they tell us. Except, of course, you cut taxes for businesses unless you compel them to spend that money on infrastructure and investment. They'll just keep it. It is 10:41. Thank you, Rose. Paul's in Bishop Stortford. Paul, what would you like to say?
I'm just, listening to this conversation going on for the last 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And I'm just exactly the same as everybody else. And he just doesn't understand, Hunt. He does not get it. People like me who've worked all their lives, I'm now sick because I have cancer.
Right.
And I'm having treatment. And, every 3 to 4 weeks, I have to go and have treatment. Then I'm laid up for at least 10 days to 2 weeks after that treatment because you're sick. You can't leave the house because of other problems, physical problems and so forth. And I'd love to go back to work, but every time I say, look, I'm feeling better, I get a respite. I have a period, maybe 3 months before I have to start treatment again because my body needs a break.
Yes.
Is that, I go, right, can I work? And my doctors go, no, you can't work, Paul. You cannot work. You physically can't work. And even though I've tried to think about maybe, why don't I do mini-cabbing or taxi driving and whatever. So I contact Hearts Council. You can't get insurance. You can't get liability. You can't get this because as soon as you list out your medical problems and the fact that out of every month you're going to, you want to work, at 2 weeks of that, you're going to be sick. So what employer is going to employ you when you're part-time and you don't know when you can come in? And on top of that, so you get signed off, and then to get signed back on takes at least 6 to 8 weeks. So for the 2 weeks I could possibly work, I then turn around to my employer and say, I'm sorry, I can't work because I'm not thing, then you have to sign back on, but it takes 6 to 8 weeks for your paperwork to be processed. So it's not something... I mean, the government's got my national insurance payments for the last 40-odd years.
Yes.
And, you know, I'm grateful for what I get, but it's not something you can live on. £101 a week is not something you can live on, you know, and I get a top-up on that of, I think it's 60 something. It's a total of £164. And I have to pay my gas, my electricity, I have to clothe myself, I have to travel for 2 hours each way in the car to go to the hospital every 4 weeks. And then in between that, I then have to go to another hospital for an injection because I have different types of cancers. And I love, you know, he's turning around and going, there's 100,000 people who, you know... You are one of the people leaving the labour force for a life on benefits, Paul. Oh, and I'm loving it. I'm loving it, you know.
It's mad, right? I've asked everybody else this question, and everyone has answered it honestly. You don't have to answer it at all.
Yeah, no, I did. I was one of those people when I was working, you know, benefit people are scroungers and so forth. I didn't think disabled people were.
Okay.
But I thought, you know, when it used to watch those real life television shows, and
of course.
There was people smoking cigarettes and got flat screen TVs and nice sofas, and I'm looking at that and going, yeah, right, they're living on that money and they've got all of that in the house. No way, they are on the dodge. Someone's taking
the mickey. Poverty porn, they called it.
There are people like that.
Of course there are, and
they are an absolute minority.
Well, the effort the production companies have to go to find the people that will fit into the category that the programme has been commissioned on the basis of are absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely. And then, of course, people like you and millions of others come away convinced that everybody unemployed is experiencing exactly the same life, and that is how it works. Find the most vulnerable people in society, misrepresent them, target them, and then do what they're doing today. Well, look, Paul, I can only wish you well, as with all of the callers today, but I think it's probably fair to say what the country really looks like, as opposed to whatever mythological creation the Tories will attempt to perpetrate in Manchester this week, largely unchallenged, of course, by our client media, by journalists who've spent the last 13 years tickling the toes of every Tory in town. It's 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 minutes to 11. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't think this is Idiot's Corner, but this is who Jeremy Hunt is trying to appeal to today. They're not talking about disabled people. They're talking about the lazy benefit cheats that are working for cash in hand and then claiming money. I know loads of them who do this. Grown, healthy, fit men. They then squander the lot down the pub. Thing is, mate, he's literally telling you you're wrong, and you are, I would suggest, too bigoted to notice. He's literally saying that 100,000 people are leaving the labour force every year for a life on benefits, and you're describing people that are, in your slightly warped worldview, already claiming benefits. But I'm grateful to you for one thing, because so far, that's the only perspective we've identified this morning to which Jeremy Hunt could be seen to be appealing. Jonathan Portes is, of course, a professor of economics at King's College London, and something of a... What's the word I'm looking for? An enthusiast for digging into detail, which often turns out to be in rather direct contradiction to what politicians are saying out loud. So, Jonathan, with your help, if you would, the 100,000 people leaving the labour force every year for a life on benefits, he makes it sound like a lifestyle choice.
It does. It's not quite clear where he got this number. What is true is that the number of people moving on to sickness and disability benefits has gone up quite significantly during and after the pandemic. But let me be clear, those people are on benefits because they have passed the DWP's work capability assessment, which, as anybody who has been through it or knows anybody who's been through it, is a pretty demanding test. They have been certified as being unable to work by the DWP. Now, it is absolutely true that we need to do a lot more to help those people those people back into the labor force. And there is a lot that the government and employers could do. And to be fair to the government, they have actually announced some modest but constructive proposals here. What is wrong, however, is this idea that there's some huge number of scroungers on disability benefits who are fit to work. We have been around this course before. In the early 2000s, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, the government tried to tighten up the test because it claimed there were this huge number of people who didn't deserve these benefits. The result, as we know, were that hundreds of thousands of people were wrongly denied benefits. A lot of hardship was caused. Some people died. We know some people literally starved to death as a result of having their benefits wrongly withdrawn. Thankfully, the government retreated from that somewhat. The test was made somewhat fairer again, and then during the pandemic, of course, a lot more people flowed on. So this is a long-standing and quite complicated problem. But we already know that simply trying to kick people off by tightening up the test will cause a huge amount of hardship for very large numbers of people, and in the long run isn't actually going to get more people back to work or save any money.
Well, that's the crucial point. And, rarely do the walls of my middle-class bubble feel thicker than when people are telling me about the actual sums of money upon which they're expected to survive, as every caller so far today has done. And that, of course, includes people who are getting a PIP payment. If you're not getting a PIP payment, if you're one of the it's about 1.5 million people who haven't been excused looking for work for a variety of reasons, including health conditions and long-term disabilities. You're getting by on probably in real terms, the lowest sum of money that anyone unemployed has been expected to get by on in living memory. Is there any rationale for threatening them with even less, somehow propelling them out of their front door in the morning?
Essentially, no. And the point I would make is that, look, we have been tightening the benefit regime for the last 20 years in various ways. We've heard this announcement a dozen times before, and we do have probably the tightest benefit regime among major advanced economies and the most stringent sanctions regime, the regime under which we punish people the most for failing to turn up to an appointment or not showing up for a job interview, even if, your kid was sick off school or something. So we have that incredibly tight regime compared to other countries. If simply cracking down on benefit cheats, supposedly, was the way to create a modern, efficient labor market, we would have the most successful advanced economy in the world, right? We've been trying this for 20 years. And the results are pretty clear. This is not the way to prosperity. It's not the way to get more people into sustained, productive jobs.
But historically, it has been a way to hoover up a certain portion of the electorate. Do you have any final thoughts on whether it will still be effective in the way that perhaps it was in the eras you've described?
It's hard to say.
Of course.
The latest British Social Attitude Survey shows, I think, that people are increasingly recognizing that the benefit system is not enough to live on, that there is a increasing amount of poverty and deprivation in the UK, and that what we used to rely on as the safety net has been increasingly eroded over the last 10 years. And I think most people, at least, will recognize that simply, trying to say that toughening up the regime is the way out of that is not the answer.
Fingers crossed. Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics at King's College London, and as I told you, if you didn't already know, rather an expert guide, a Sherpa through these sort of issues. It is 10:56. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A couple more of your calls on this. You're welcome, of course, to expand upon the idea that this is a good policy and that people currently getting by on next to nothing will miraculously discover an appetite for work and an ability to work if their next to nothing is reduced still further. I can't see it. I'm not going to lie to you. I can't see it, but it doesn't mean it's not there. Jim's in Cardiff. Jim, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I'd like to say that I was actually one of those people I was on a tipping point where I could have worked or could have gone on benefit because I come from a good background and I had a reasonable education, but then during university, I suffered with mental illness, which has recurred ever since. Okay. But I've been able to manage it with support and with the NHS,
Yes.
such that I've now got a professional career, and I've got a supportive employer. I've got in the public sector, which I think is a big help.
Yes, I suspect.
But
you're
at
right.
one time, I was basically a revolving door patient. I was going into psychiatric hospital for a sort of brief spell, so I was never that ill. I was never dangerous. I was always
Yes.
relatively sane, but I was not quite well enough to work. So I had this sort of thing where in 2 years I went in about 3 or 4 times, I think, and eventually I thought something's got to change here.
Yes.
But I could have gone on benefit full time easily at that time, and I chose not to. And I think that's partly because of background, because I was expecting to work, and I was expected to work, and I think had the benefit of aspiration, which is a big difference.
You may be right, but it sounds to me more about the efforts your employer made to accommodate you than it does about...
No, this is before I had
Okay.
a really, really rough employer at the time. So I've dragged myself into a decent job.
Oh, well, that's good.
With good conditions, and
they
it's been a
accommodate
battle.
they accommodate the days that you can't work, do they?
Yeah, they're very good. It's a county council. I'm not saying which one.
No, of course.
Because I'm a bridge engineer and there aren't many of us around. But
that's a job I'd do.
I don't want to identify myself.
No, that's fine. Well, don't
illness.
say any. Yes, I see.
I can't do it. No, don't worry. Yeah.
I just wanted to check something while you were talking because I thought I might have misremembered. Hang on, let's just pause for a musical interlude. That was rather nice. I feel like a proper DJ now.
Sorry,
that's all right.
Calling me.
Don't worry. Because you just said something there about the public sector being probably a better place to work in your situation than the private sector would be.
In terms of conditions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just remembered that the newspapers last week were getting very excited about the fact that British workers in the public sector take more time off sick than British workers in the private sector, as if that was somehow evidence that you're all shirkers. Yes, exactly, because they can. That's the point, isn't it?
And the ones in the private sector then break and end up on benefits.
Yeah, exactly that. And then they get attacked from. This is an astonishing array of sound effects you've got over in Cardiff, Jim. I have to say, there goes.
My son has now set off the smoke alarm. I better go, I think.
I think you better just check that it is your son and not the smoke. That was amazing. That's a new record. I don't think we've ever had such a dizzying array of sound effects. It's almost like Nick Abbott was ringing into the programme. Thank you, Jim, and take care. Managing to extract a little bit of levity from what is a fairly grim vista of experience as I glance to my right and see Jeremy Hunt, who I think Rose's description of will stay with us for some time, preparing to tell the Conservative conference in Manchester that that there are 100,000 people leaving the Labour force every year for a life on benefits, as if they are doing so through choice and whimsy as opposed to necessity and in many cases illness. But hey-ho, whether or not it works, only time will tell. It's just gone 11 o'clock. Up next, I think we'll turn our attention to what the shop staff should be doing to deal with the shoplifters.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 4 minutes after 11, and I used that phrase with Jonathan a moment ago. The thickness of my the thickness of the walls, or the walls of my middle class bubble, are never thicker than when we are discussing some subjects. And I wonder how many other people could right now tell you what the national living wage is today for people currently on the national living wage. Could you tell me what it is? Do you know what it is? Do you know what the national living wage is right now for an adult, for a working adult? So £10.42. And will be announced in this speech that it will rise to £11.16 an hour next April, which is, I suppose, in relative or comparative terms, which is good news. So £10.42 an hour. The fellow who runs Iceland has been in the news a lot. Did you see when he said that some of his staff had been threatened or even perhaps assaulted by shoplifters claiming that they had HIV-infected needles in their hands? I did find myself thinking that all sounds a little bit sort of 1980s tabloids, and I'm not sure it was even true then. And he had to withdraw it and apologise. I don't know if you saw that story. He also withdrew from the Tory party at the weekend. What's his name? Richard something. See, Richard Walker. He's been on LBC quite a few times, and he comes across quite well. I've always found. But that needle stuff looked dodgy from the start, and indeed turned out to be. But his announcement that he was leaving the Tory party on the grounds that it doesn't really do any of the things that it was supposed to do, or that it did when he was first drawn to it, I thought was a rare outbreak of honesty on that side of the political fence. Interesting. But I mention that only because of the shoplifting angle, because £10.42, if someone was threatening you with an infected needle, but that you don't need to imagine an infected needle. You could imagine a broken bottle or a knife or just a clenched fist. Or a supermarket trolley. Someone comes at you at full tilt with a supermarket trolley, you're going to flipping know about it. I'm quite chummy with one of the security guards at my local supermarket. He's a big fan of the programme, and we freaked his wife out once he was on the phone to her and he just handed me the phone to say hello to her, and she couldn't believe her ears, which was a really lovely moment. And I worry, because we've got quite a lot of trouble around our way with shoplifters, and you worry about what people are supposed to do in the event of encountering it. And I haven't had the conversation. I don't know if it would be appropriate to do so, but my advice would be don't go near them. Not for, I don't know what security staff are on, but there'll be people working in many shops who are on £10.42 an hour. If you think I'm going to risk my safety to protect your inanimate objects for £10.42 an hour, then you've got another thing coming. And I wonder if that's the beginning of the problem. Also, that conversation we just had in the last hour, that angle is almost always missing from right-wing coverage of this shoplifting epidemic, isn't it? The fact that some people are just so skinned that they're desperate, and there is help available, but often not enough help. I mean, I just don't know what the impetus would be to get stuck in for staff, never mind everybody else. And I want to look at that. How scared do you get as shop staff? I don't know how much detail we can go into with regard to what the company policy actually is. You can go into as much detail as you want if you don't name the company. Just give us a broad... Well, don't worry about that, actually. I'll worry about that when you get on. So I told you, didn't I, the story of when I worked for River Island, and this is going back so far, 30 years. Or more, 32 years. And the manager sent me out to chase after someone that he thought he knew was a professional shoplifter. And I was young and stupid. I nearly did the line from Point Break then, which would have been highly inappropriate. The fun of it, I thought I'm going to catch a crook. I'm following him. I'm going up Worcester High Street, up towards the cathedral. For those of you who know that part of the Midlands, there's a statue of Edward Elgar. I've got him in my sights. I didn't have a walkie-talkie or anything like that, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility that at that point in my life, I might have imagined I had a walkie-talkie. I'd be reporting back to base. I've got him in my sights. The bill was very popular at the time, so I think there would have been a very Sun Hill flavour to my pursuit of this well-known shoplifter, who was a professional. So he turned up in a suit and tie with a big briefcase, like a double thickness briefcase, and his MO apparently was to fill it with Levi's jeans. I told you this a few weeks ago, and I didn't catch. Well, I did catch because he knew that I was following him, and eventually he just shouted at me, "I haven't stolen anything!" And he opened his briefcase in front of me, and it was actually empty. So I think we had clocked him and gone after him before he'd actually done the nicking, which obviously meant that there was, no second chapter to that story. But I want to discuss this from two angles, all right? And I think it's important to pinpoint both of them. There is the moral, and then there is the actual. So from a moral angle, stealing is bad. And like you, I was raised to kind of believe that it was bad. A brief flirtation with shoplifting at Woolworths in Kidderminster in 1987 notwithstanding, I've always had a fairly reliable moral compass. And if I saw you stealing, certainly 10 years ago, I would have told someone, unless you were 8'4". But I might even have called it out myself. I might even have... If you saw a mother pushing a pushchair around a supermarket and you noticed her slipping some nappies under the pillow in the pram, what would you do right now in 2023? Particularly as someone who listens to stories on this programme that perhaps provide many of us with a perspective on experiences and existences that we wouldn't otherwise know a lot about. What would you do? Hand on heart, what would you do? You saw someone, a mum. I've gone for the most emotionally provocative example I can think of. You know, if you saw the local skaghead nicking a bottle of Archers, then you probably would have a slightly different attitude. But if you saw a mum, what if you saw someone stealing food and it wasn't smoked salmon, it wasn't food that you would take down the pub to sell, it was carrots. If you saw someone stealing carrots, what would you do? Because I think there is a danger in these discussions, and we've had a few of them now, of thinking that all of the thieving is done by addicts or professionals, and none of the thieving is done by people who are desperate. So I don't know how you have a meaningful conversation about this without somehow working out how to distinguish between those different categories. There was an astonishing article in the Telegraph today. I didn't cut it out for you, so I'll dig it out now. I think it was on page 7. It's weird how my memory works, isn't it? And I've probably not got a page 7. I got a page 7? No, I haven't. I've torn out page 7 for other reasons. But there's an extraordinary article in the Telegraph today suggesting a sort of organised crime cartel. I've already torn it out of the paper to share with you a story that was on page 6. Oh, no, I haven't. I've got it here. This is very professional, isn't it? All we need now is some weird sound effects going off in the background and we'll have the full set. So it was an astonishing report on what you might call an organised crime cartel, a gang headed by two brothers who used their inside knowledge this is from a police and crime commissioner in Sussex. She's the national lead for business and retail crime. Two brothers who used their inside knowledge of supermarket systems to shoplift £500,000 worth of goods over 2.5 years. And in some cases, you go back in to claim money on the stolen gear. So that's a very different constituency from the local heroin addict who is stealing either to order or to sell in the nearest pub. And then you've got the people who are just going to the self-checkout and putting a few things straight into the bag without actually running it through the till, because they can't actually afford everything that they, and I'm going to say want. Yes, a lot of you saying that you'd pay for the nappies with the mum, but that involves you telling her that you've seen what she's doing, and putting yourself in a position where you could either come in for quite a lot of abuse yourself. She could. It's that getting involved element. But paying for it is by far the best thing you can do if you are going to get involved. Don't do that. Let me pay. But what are you going to do next week? You're going to follow her around for the rest of her life? What are you going to do the week after that? Do you see what I mean? How do you deal with the people that are doing it out of desperation? I genuinely don't know. But here is the question. What do you, as a staff member, think about this epidemic of shoplifting? As a staff member, as someone genuinely on the front line. And the question then becomes, what would you do about it? 0345 6060 973. I don't really care what politicians have to say on this subject yet, because it's too late, isn't it, for anyone to approach it with any credibility? They've literally watched the problem explode. They've literally presided over an absolutely enormous rise in this sort of thing, and they've failed utterly to address it. So I hope that this initiative known as Pegasus will work. But I tell you now, it's got a lot to do not only with police shortages, but also with police deployment. It's got a lot to do with poverty, and it's got a lot to do with impunity. The idea that there's a single answer to 5 different questions seems to me to be at best unlikely. But if you work in shops, what would you do? 0345 6060 973. We got a new supermarket on Thursday. My local shop changed premises. It's the same brand. It's still a Morrison's, but it's moved from a fairly rough around the edges old site into a brand spanking new, glorious, shiny site in the middle of a new development. And I came across something I've never come across before. And if I don't think you're going to laugh at me about this one, because when I moved to the Harrow Road when we first got married, which would be in 2000, I remember saying on the radio, they've got alarms on the meat. I'd seen alarms on spirits before, but it was amazing that they had alarms on the meat, and most people were surprised. It wasn't a common experience in most supermarkets. In our local supermarket now, all of the champagne and spirits are behind transparent doors. Have you seen this? Have you ever seen this? And there's a button. So if you want to buy a bottle of champagne, let's say a bottle of gin, actually, just so we can't open ourselves up to accusations of champagne socialism. If you want to buy a bottle of gin, there's a button that you press, and a member of staff will be with you within a minute, and they will open the glass doors and remove your gin and give it to you, and it's still got the tag on it, so it's still got the security tag on it that needs to be removed with the special equipment at the till, and then they'll close it again and it's locked. I've never seen that before, and I suspect it's novel technology because it's literally a brand spanking new supermarket. It hasn't even been open for a week yet. But that probably makes more sense, doesn't it, than encouraging staff to chase people or go after them. So what is the status quo in the shops where you work? I mean, A, how bad is the problem? But I think we've got a fairly clear idea on that. And B, what would you do if you were in charge? In the shop where you work, if you were in charge of reducing stealing, what would you do? 0345 6060 973. Because remember, we live in a country now where there is alarmed cheese. Cheese alarms. Sounds like a really rubbish punk band. There are alarms now on cheese, on large chunks of cheese in this country. So it's got a touch of the King Canutes about it, I think, this problem. The idea that you can turn these tides back is, as King Canute, of course, well knew, a little bit pie in the sky. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And the reason why the question is particularly interesting today is that there are warnings of, and I quote, carnage at Christmas unless action was urgently taken now. So what should that action be? And how do you respond to my suggestion that if you're working in a shop, almost even if you are a security guard, it's not your job to chase people and put yourself at risk? Hit the numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 11. So I guess it's not a kind of, oh, woe is us, state of the nation phone in this. It's a question about an epidemic of thieving from shops, some of which I think might be morally defensible, some of which clearly will never be morally defensible. And a sensible question among people who either work in shops or shop in shops. You know, I love shop subjects because they are truly universal. Except for that one moment where Rishi Sunak didn't seem to know how to use a debit card. I've always been of the view that everybody knows what it's like to go shopping, except perhaps the King. Do you think the King goes shopping? They always said the late Queen never carried money. So I'm talking myself out of my enthusiasm for shop-based subjects, apart from the ludicrously privileged, the ludicrously aloof. Everyone goes shopping. And that's one of the reasons why I like talking about shopping-related issues on the programme. So from either side of the till, either as a shop worker or a shop user, how would you stop this now? It genuinely feels to me like King Canute going down the beach to prove to his nobles that he can't stop the tide coming. How do you stop this now? What do you do? Well, we need more police officers. Really? Is that going to help? So an imaginative answer to the question has just been introduced in my local Morrison's, where they've got transparent cabinets now, locked, and you press a button and a member of staff comes. But that calculation there is cost benefit, isn't it? For years now, I suspect that the epidemic in shoplifting has been caused by the fact that companies considered it was financially better to absorb the losses than it was to address the problem. There's so much going on here that I just think sometimes the sort of woe is me and supermarket bosses coming out talking about HIV-infected needles are profoundly unhelpful. 22 after 11. And if you don't think it matters, the more stealing there is, the more the prices go up. So it's us that end up paying for shoplifting, not the supermarkets, which is part of the reason why they're not doing as much as they could do, I think. Mark's in Edinburgh. Mark, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, good morning, James. It's double-sided, really. I've come from a very, should we say, poorish background in my youth, in the 70s.
Sure.
And I'll try not to make the story too long, but effectively, I've had a very wealthy career, done very well for myself, and recently fallen on hard times. I changed my career, started a business, went through divorce.
Okay.
I have a son that suffers with Asperger's, and I was in a supermarket the other day and I noticed a young man, probably in his early 20s, stealing soup, ravioli, spaghetti.
Tinned.
And there would be absolutely no point in stealing that stuff for going on and feeding a drug habit.
No.
It was purely to feed himself. You could tell he was malnourished. I would have normally been the type of person to have sort of said, that person's stealing over there. And something's changed in me since my circumstances changed. My son's disability allowance has been stopped because he's now living full-time with me and no longer with my ex-partner. And they've suspended it for no reason other than the fact that it's change of responsibility.
Good Lord.
And now all I can do is empathise with these people on a level that I've just never been able to do before.
You can conceive of someone not being able to feed themselves because there's just no money left in the bank account or the pocket.
I have to say I was a person who thought, but these people are just rotten to the core. They steal, they don't realise. But I'm being faced with the same thing with social services, stopping a payment that's completely valid for my son who has Asperger's. Just because he now wants to live full-time with his daddy, they won't change the payment to me. And I've just recently lost my business. And it's hard bringing a son, having to take him on a 40 minutes each way to his school and back every morning and every afternoon. And I'm feeling desperate, and I've had a very good career. And if I'm feeling desperate and I'm struggling with my mental health, what are these poor people that can't afford to feed themselves?
You've done a better job than me of knitting together the two topics that we've been discussing this morning, haven't you? Because you really have. You've kind of brought the last topic smack into the centre of this one. And at the heart of both is this notion of change. Because you and me could bring our 1970s or 1980s sensibilities to this conversation if we wanted, and possibly we would do if it wasn't for in your case, your experiences, in my case, having a job where people share their experiences with me, and I'd have to be made of butter not to change my mind about things. But it is a different proposition now. Nicking soup and tinned food is neither a lifestyle choice nor evidence of criminality in the conventional sense. It's evidence of desperation, complete desperation.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I like I say, I would have always been first. I mean, I've caught children stealing before that had £300 pairs of trainers on, and of course I've told staff. The staff did nothing. But when you see a young man who obviously is in desperate need of some food, I had a little smile to myself and said, good luck to you, pal. I hope you get away with it and get lots in your bag, because that's really what we've come to now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the broader dimension of that is, but I think I'm much closer to where you are than I am to where you would once have expected to be. What would staff members do? You can't, they could end up going after lads like him and then leaving completely alone the ones that are nicking the high-end stuff, because they would pose a much greater threat to their own safety.
Well, this is it. And like the conversation topic has mentioned before, people just aren't paid enough money these days to worry about it. I mean, I know from experience that when people are faced with not being able to afford the bills and not being able to afford the mortgage, I've been forced to sell my home. I know exactly what it feels like to feel like you've lost everything and you're destitute. And people sitting in a job where they go, I can't afford to pay my mortgage every month. I'm overdrawn. I don't go out. I don't socialise. Why do I want to go and chase after a thief and put my life in danger? That's
very nicely put.
I certainly wouldn't want to.
No, nor would I, mate. And I'm sorry for what you're going through, what you've been through. But thank goodness it's increased your empathy, because people can go in the opposite direction and can become even more isolated and insular. But the central question of how would you fit, because you can talk all you want about criminal gangs and addicts, that's probably not remotely relevant in the case that Mark describes. And you can't walk around supermarkets all the time trying to identify shoplifters who look sympathetic and offering to pay for their goods, although I'm gratified by the number of people listening who, in the theoretical example I gave you, would go and offer to pay for the young mother's nappies. And then the government will come in, perhaps inevitably, and treat it like a sort of war. It's just as they're getting underway with the war on motorists. No, hang on. They're doing the opposite of the war on motorists. There is no war on motorists. But Rishi Sunak is the man who borrowed a car from a Sainsbury's worker for a photo opportunity. He is the man to lead the fight back against the non-existent war on motorists. That was this weekend's news. And now it's a war on shoplifting, which makes a little bit more sense because the shoplifting problem at least exists, but it's got, and it has gone up by 37% in a year. But I'd love to know what people who actually understand the issues think a solution looks like, as opposed to politicians desperately searching for headlines. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Andy's in Guildford. Andy, what made you pick up the phone?
What made me pick up the phone? Right, I'm an OAP.
You're a what, mate?
I went in an OAP.
Oh, yes.
Pensioner,
okay, yes.
Right. Now, I'm dead against shoplifting. Full stop. I don't steal. I don't expect my kids to steal.
No, of course.
I was in the co-op by me 3 days ago.
Yes.
I was doing a bit of shopping, right? And this guy walks in, and he's looking round and saying, "Now he's gone straight to the meat counter." And he must have picked up, I don't know how many bits he had, but he had an armful of not just fish fingers, but top ends.
Wouldn't be
meat.
Fish fingers at the meat counter.
No,
Steaks,
no,
nice stuff.
Steak.
Fillet mince. And
you know what I'm saying?
let me tell you what happened next. He walked straight out the shop and nothing happened. So the question becomes, what should have happened? What should have happened?
The girl what was there should have either said something to him, not approach him, but make him aware that he was nicking. Call the manager. I was going to say something, you know, and for 2 pins, I don't know what I'd done, but
well, you didn't do anything, did you? And I'd rather you didn't, because you could get yourself into bother. And the same with the young woman probably on £10.42 an hour, who also decided not to stick herself in front of potential danger.
The thing is, my problem is, with what I do, I'm checked by the police and the council once a year for anything on my record. All it takes is for an occurrence, and it comes back on me. But
sorry, you've lost me now. You're on some sort of register.
No, what I do part time, I'm checked out by the council. I have to have a police check once a year,
right,
to get my badge.
Oh, I see.
know.
Yes, okay, fair enough. So you couldn't chin him, in other words.
Well,
but why would you? So just on a very simple level, I mean, you're obviously right that stealing's wrong, and he very much sounds like someone who's stealing to sell it on in order to feed a habit or something like that. But you're in a shop that's probably posted profits of tens of millions of pounds. I don't know what the co-op's financial situation is, but it's pretty healthy. Why should you? If they can't be bothered to deal with it, why the hell should you? And if they can't be bothered to pay professionals to deal with it, why should that young woman?
Yeah, but that's just me. You know what I mean? I don't like.
Well, it's not though, is it? Because you can't risk your badge.
Now I can't, but before, more likely I would have done. But it makes me think. Well, I'm going around paying for my shopping.
Yes.
With a little bit of money you get, and you got like that, just walking in.
Yes.
And I dread.
But they don't. The reason why they don't address it is because they'll just put the prices up for everybody else, and then their profits are largely unaffected. It's only now that things have reached such a ludicrous level, this 37% increase in the last year, that they're thinking, well, actually, no, we can't afford this, so we will pay £60,000 each over 2 years for Opel investigators to identify shoplifting gangs, drawing on police and industrial. Information, intelligence. I think, here we go, just because I find this stuff interesting. Co-op's profits, this is the Retail Insight Network, went up by £190 million in the year to 2022. So, you know, they can afford to fix it, and yet I think once I'd have been closer to where you are and thought, well, it's my job as a citizen to step in. Where do their responsibilities begin and end? 11:32 is the time, and I certainly wouldn't want the young woman to put herself in any danger whatsoever to protect meat. Thomas Watts is here with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:36 is the time. Back to shoplifting in a moment. I just struck by something that popped up in the last hour that I think I'm going to hit you over the head with for the second time, because we didn't talk about this last week. I can't remember why. I don't know. It obviously isn't a sort of coverage that's designed to provide editorial for programmes like this. But the story about... Here it is. I should have known. No, it can't be, can it? I'm just looking at the story. That's from May 2022. So it comes around with regular... with grim regularity, stories about how sickness absences in the public sector are higher than they are in the private sector. And here is the hilariously named Taxpayers Alliance in May 2022, publishing research that shows you get more sickness absence in the public sector than you do in the private sector. And then I know I saw something last week being reported about sick leave in public versus private as well. And I suddenly realised why that is, or a large part of the reason why that is that if you're lucky enough to have a job in the public sector, your employer will endeavour to make sure that your health issues are accommodated by your workplace. So mental health in particular would be better understood. And then it arrives in the right-wing media as proof that everybody in the public sector is swinging the lead. The real question should be, why is the private sector doing so little to help people with health conditions, whether physical or mental, back into work? Why is the private sector doing so little to help people with health conditions work? Not why are people with health conditions and jobs getting help from their employers to keep their jobs. Incredible when you see that Tufton Street right-wing media, right wing of the Tory party hat trick of input, when you see it knitted together so clearly, and yet even someone who does this for a living doesn't notice it until someone else ringing into the programme points it out. Of course you're going to get more sick days if you work for an employer that understands the importance of accommodating your health condition. And for reasons that you can speculate onto your heart's content, that's more likely to happen in the public sector than it is in the private sector. 11:38 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we return our attention next to the Holy Grail. I don't want to come up with a brilliant idea on this programme because then someone listening to it will probably make a fortune from implementing it. But this is public service broadcasting at its finest. How would you fix the current shoplifting epidemic? And how much credibility do you give to my theory that now that the supermarkets are actually losing enough money to make them sit up and take notice, we'll probably find that solutions are a lot easier to come across than was previously suspected. Daniel is in Birmingham. Daniel, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, mate.
Thank you for having me on your show. A little bit nervous, first time caller.
It's only me.
I have to agree with you, unfortunately, in the fact that it is very much like King Canute. I think the government and society as a whole have let so many things slide for such a long time that, unfortunately, we are now reaching a point where people don't worry about consequences. And if you don't worry about consequences, then you have no fear. I'm very fortunate. I'm a serving police officer in a large force in this country.
Yeah.
I also am very privileged to have been a business owner and in private retail as well. And prior to my work for the police, I was actually a store security guard.
Good Lord! You're ridiculously well qualified for this conversation.
Exactly. I can give you some really interesting points of view on quite a few of your topics, although I don't think I can give you an answer, unfortunately.
No, that's very honest of you.
First of all, I think your callers so far and yourself have been quite right. There are two different types of shoplifter. There is those who steal bread and soup, as your previous caller said, to feed their families. I can only say I have compassion and an empathy for them. I, like you, am practicing Christian. I have seen people shoplifting, and I have said, I'll buy you food instead.
That's nice. How does that work? What sort of reaction do you get when you do that?
Gratefulness.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing, I was on holiday in America earlier this year, and the city that I was visiting have changed their laws in relation to shoplifting specifically.
Right.
That the police will not get involved unless the shoplifting is over $1,000.
Good Lord.
And yes, strangely enough, everyone who I spoke to said that, shoplifting has gone through the roof because they can steal with impunity. And I can say from personal experience, prior to COVID, when I was involved in a retail venture, we were told by our local police team that policed the high street that we were in that, pretty much, unless the shoplifting was over about £500, they wouldn't respond because they just didn't have resources. And this isn't me trying to beat up the police.
No, quite the other. You haven't got the resources. You haven't got the resources.
No, exactly. And they were just being honest with
bizarrely, just to bring all the topics back to the same table, one of the reasons why they haven't got the resources is because they're dealing with things that they shouldn't really be dealing with because the collapse in social care and mental health services, which is why Rowley and I think one other chief constable have said we're not going to be helping out in those areas anymore, which just leaves more holes in society through which the vulnerable can fall.
I have to agree. And then the shop that I was involved in, it was lovely. We didn't do food or necessities. We just did luxury things. And we were targeted by professional shoplifters, and it drove the business under.
Yeah, really? It was that bad?
Yeah.
God. So the big businesses can absorb it.
Oh, small businesses can't.
Small businesses can't.
As I said, prior to being a police officer, I worked for Debenhams. I can talk about them because they're no longer here.
This is true. How much of that do you take personal responsibility for?
I left a long time ago, so I'm not too worried about that.
That's what they always say. The damage was done, Daniel. The damage was done.
Exactly. But they had, working in loss prevention there, they had basically Debenhams, I think, were budgeting 10% loss of profits on shoplifting, and kind of they can afford that. As a small business, you can't afford 10% of your profits to just disappear.
So what would you do then? Because I mean, did you hear me say about the transparent cabinets at my local supermarket? Have you heard of that before? Where you hit the button and the staff comes to open it for you. It's quite fun, actually.
I haven't seen that yet, but I'm genuinely not surprised.
No, but that's going to have to be originality. Is going to have to be part of the answer, not just a vivifying of traditional methods, but rebranding. I often think in continental Europe, it's hard to get out. There's a lot of turnstiles. I think that I had to show my receipt once to get out of a supermarket, and that was normal. I hadn't been taught. So they're going to have to come up with more imaginative ways of addressing this problem.
But the problem is prevention in all of those circumstances costs.
Well, which is why big business will be a better place to deal with it than small business. I suppose you could have delis ending up like jewellers with a buzzer on the door.
Yeah.
And what have you. But then it's crazy, right? I mean, it's truly crazy, this.
It is. And just to cover your topic, you were saying about people being threatened with HIV-loaded needles. And having worked, this is 20 years ago, when I was in store security, we were threatened with people spitting in our faces, saying that they've got hepatitis, saying that they've got HIV. I had a car driven at me once from a shoplifter.
What were you when you were outside?
Yeah, I stopped them, and they were loading up the car with the stuff that they'd stolen. I was telling them to stop, and that the police had been called, and they carried on loading up, and there were 3 of them and 1 of me, so I'm not going to get myself involved in a fight.
No.
But then...
how do you make that decision? What when you're in the job? What's the... Because as a police officer, you don't really get to pick and choose which people you go after. If you don't go after someone who is obviously a wrong 'un, you could get into trouble professionally. But as a security guard working for a shop, how does that work?
Interestingly, they talk about that, but certainly back then, they talk about the fact that it is insured and that you want to take a risk.
Right.
But then kind of where do you draw the line? And it's very difficult. I mean, the circumstance that I was talking about, red mist had descended a little bit, and I wasn't thinking as risk adverse as I probably should have been.
Yeah.
But that's difficult once you started something. It's very hard.
I completely agree. I just wondered and part of that for them is a sort of preemptive hand washing exercise. So if you do get into any bother, then legally they can say, well, we encourage people like Daniel not to get involved in these situations. So there'll be a bit of backside covering going on as well. Mate, it may be a bit late for the junction. I hope you've got... from our point of view, you have made loads of brilliant points. Just to clarify, if you weren't listening, why he references the HIV story, the boss of Iceland has apologised and retracted a claim that 3 staff actually contracted HIV as a result of needle attacks. It's been written up in this article by the BBC as the boss of Ireland has been forced to apologise, which I think is a bit ungenerous. Richard Walker said he made the comments in error in a draft article about threats of violence against store workers by shoplifters for Mail Online. I think when people apologise, I don't know if he was forced to or not, but I know that Suella Braverman hasn't apologised yet for another article in the Mail that told lies about grooming gangs. And it meant the Mail on Sunday actually had to apologise for an article written by a serving Home Secretary because even by the incredibly light touch regulation of British newspapers, she crossed the lying line. But, of course, if you think shoplifters have got impunity, wait until you meet the cabinet.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 minutes to 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've just been reminded, which one was it that pointed out shoplifting had gone down during lockdown because all the shops were shut? Was it Priti Patel? Oh, man alive. They're just so awful. They're all so awful. I heard her today saying, she was talking about, as many people will know, my family had shops when we were growing up. How arrogant are you? As many people will know. I don't know what... I know Sadiq Khan's dad was a bus driver, because he mentions it quite often. And I know that Rishi Sunak's dad was a doctor, his mum was a chemist, but I couldn't have told you for all the tea in China what Priti Patel's. But anyway, if you only ever hang around with people that don't think you're frightful, then you never really get a clear picture of just how frightful you are. Thankfully for you, Natasha Clark is at the Conservative conference in Manchester, so that you don't have to be. And she joins me now. Can I ask a question about mood, or is that A, predictable, and B, pointless? Presumably you can tell when an atmosphere is jubilant, or
not buzzing, James. It's definitely not buzzing.
Buzzing's a good word. And then when Cameron delivered his speech in opposition, actually went to conference when he was up against David Davis for the job. That put a bit of a bounce in Tories who were attending. But I presume this one is about as low energy as it's possible to imagine so far.
I don't think that's quite where we're at.
No.
I think it's okay. I give it a 5 out of 10. Is that fair?
Yeah.
For the Tories, they just want to get through this without messing up. The bar is very low. We all know what happened last year. Liz Truss, hugely disastrous conference last year. And essentially the bar is just, we need to be better than that. So I think if Downing Street will be very happy if they can just get through this without any major hiccups, without any major huge rows, without any government ministers going too far off piste or quitting or saying anything mad. I think that's where we're at. We're at a very low bar. And yes, not buzzing yet, but there's a fair amount of people around, and I think people are still having those conversations that they always do, all the schmoozing that happens in these receptions and around the conferences and around the fringe. So yeah, so far I think it's okay.
And how much should we read into photographs of the keynote speech Mark Harper has been given while you've been preparing to come on here, where the room looks close to empty?
Yeah, I've seen the pictures. It doesn't look great for poor old Mark Harper, and I'm sure he's facing a grilling from everybody here at conference about HS2.
Maybe people had transport problems getting to the conference.
I mean, they did. We all did. We all struggled with the trains and the buses and automobiles getting up here. So yes, not a great look for the Tories on day one to have Mark Harper. But then also, he wasn't never going to bring in the big guns. I think people like James Cleverly, people like Kemi Badenoch will probably get the Tory right a little bit more excited.
Okay. What else have you been up to?
So today, here at the main conference hall, we've all been talking about HS2 and tax cuts, as I know you've been discussing. Two rows the Conservative Party don't really want to be having as they try and distance themselves from last year's disastrous conference, as we mentioned, under Liz Truss. And up here, causing a little bit of mischief with us, was Andy Burnham, the Labour Mayor of Manchester. So I asked him about those rumours that Rishi Sunak will be scrapping the Manchester leg of HS2 within weeks. He then accused ministers of treating northerners like second-class citizens and leaving them behind. Here's a clip of what he had to say.
This is a conversation we've been completely shut out of so far, and it's not really good enough because it's got epic implications for the north of England. If we get left with Victorian rail infrastructure, the northern half of the country, with all of the chaos that comes daily for people as a result of that, but the southern half has new kind of east-west and north-south lines, I mean, goodness me, where will the north-south divide be in the next 20, 30 years if that is what happens? So, it's frustrating. I just will have a pretty blunt message for ministers. Why is it always people in the north who are treated as second-class citizens when it comes to transport investment?
Pretty punchy from the Mayor of Manchester there. But then obviously as the Labour representative, he's a little bit early for his own conference. Obviously that's kicking off next week in Liverpool. But I think everybody will be asking Labour now those big questions. Now they are on the precipice of a possible Labour government within the year. What would Labour do differently? So I thought I'd point out to him that his own party haven't committed to building it in full either. I asked him, are you urging your Labour colleagues to commit to building it in full if they make it to number 10 next year? Here's what he had to say.
Of course, I'm not going to say not, but there is a commitment that had been made before. I mean, obviously, that may need to be looked at in the light of whatever the government announces, but they have made a commitment in the past. So I'd be really keen to talk to Keir and shadow ministers next week because levelling up cannot happen, in my view, true levelling up, without that big strategic infrastructure. And the idea today from the government that you can scatter a bit of money here and there to kind of 50 towns seemingly chosen at random, well, I'm not sure how random they've been chosen, that levels up and you can do it without strategic infrastructure. Well, sorry, I don't buy that at all.
So there is a little bit of pressure on the Labour Party as they gather next week in Liverpool, coming from their own Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham. And obviously last week you guys will remember the furious letter that Andy Burnham wrote to the Prime Minister about HS2, urging him not to bin it, not to scrap it, saying it would be absolutely disastrous for the North. So then I asked him, well, have you even got a reply from the Prime Minister?
Not that I'm aware of. And it sounds to me like they've pretty much taken a decision, but have decided not to announce it because they're here. Well, that's really worrying. Bear in mind, this has been in 3 Conservative manifestos up until this point. And it's not just the north-south infrastructure. What it enables is that east-west line across the north of England. So they really will be pulling the plug on us if they do this.
Andy Burnham there, clearly being shut out of the major decisions on HS2. He said he will be meeting with the rail minister today. He told me to try and find out what is really going on, whether it will be delayed. But some conversations we've also been having today with people suggest that the Prime Minister could just kick the can down the road and launch another big review. Very bold.
You've got to love a review. What would you speculate might be pulled out of hats? Let's focus on the Prime Minister. I mean, it doesn't have to be a very big rabbit. It could even be a rabbit, Natasha, that we've already had glimpses of. But he's got to throw something into the mix, doesn't he, during his big speech?
Yeah, he really does. And so far, the stuff that's been sort of briefed out to various newspapers that we've seen isn't very inspiring, is it? Like, banning smoking and reforming of A-levels. It's
mobile
not really
phones in schools.
Banning mobile phones in schools. It's not really very inspiring to the wider electorate. But yeah, Rishi is going to have to, in the next 24, 48 hours, decide what he's going to pull out of his magical hat when he does make his conference speech on Wednesday. And this could be the last conference that we have before he goes to the polls in a general election. And still people repeatedly here are going, we don't really know what Senekism means, we don't really know what Rishi stands for, we don't know what policies he would bring. And obviously there is a really fine balancing line there, because he doesn't want Labour to nick all their good ideas, but he absolutely has to.
That's a very generous analysis.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is he's got loads of brilliant ideas, but they all go to a different school. He just doesn't want to tell them, lest Keir Starmer steal them. It's usually the opposition that has that defence.
It works both ways.
To the government, indeed it does. Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, live from the Conservative conference in Manchester, where if you are amused by such things, if you indulge the occasional schadenfreude and you find Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, an unsympathetic character, then you may enjoy looking at photographs of the largely empty hall to which he has been delivering a speech. Riley was in it, so not entirely empty, clearly. Some breaking news for you. Actually, you've heard it in the bulletins, but I'll mention it because it's really important. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine has been awarded to a pair of scientists who developed the technology that led to the mRNA COVID vaccines. That's Professor Katalin Karikó and Professor Drew Weissman will share the prize. And of course, before the pandemic, this technology was experimental, but it has now been given to millions of people around the world and obviously saved countless lives, but also, of course, saved countless people from enduring much worse experiences with COVID than they otherwise would have done. It's coming up to 12 noon. My apologies to Ollie and Simon and Steve and David and others who are waiting to talk to me about shoplifting. It's one of those subjects. I know I never know how much I should share with you about the relative difficulties of my job, but shoplifting is one of those subjects that's getting bigger and won't go away. But it doesn't. If you want to have a slightly different conversation every time you address the general broad subject, it doesn't always work. But it did today, and I feel we've got further to go on things that might actually work in terms of stopping it from happening or cutting it from happening. Because I don't know that anyone's got much of a clue in that field. And I've got 2 ideas for the next hour, which are both very different. One inspired by something we just heard Andy Burnham say, and another about the damage done to children by angry adults.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, for which I thank you. I forget to do that, and I no doubt will continue to forget, but when I remember, I shall definitely mention it. A couple of stories that you may not be aware of. One of the companies, I shouldn't laugh, but one of the companies that introduced a 4-day working week trial in June, saying it would do it for 6 months, has now called it off early, saying that it has actually made staff more stressed, which I thought was just, I don't know. I thought that was mildly diverting. And the story there that Andy Burnham shared just puzzles me, doesn't it? How can we have the so-called Red Wall in 2019, but also have a fairly plausible depiction of the North, people in the north of England being treated as second-class citizens by the Conservative government in London? I don't think it's like completely befuddling, but I'm fascinated by the north-south divide, and we may return to that territory later in the week. Speaking of north-south divides, a story in the bulletin there about ScotRail, about ticket prices in Scotland did make me reflect upon the fact that when we're getting better. I would say that for media that attempts to speak to the whole of the UK, we're pretty good now on this programme. It was my New Year's resolution 2 or 3 years ago that we would try to do a better job of covering Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh politics and specifics without obviously alienating the bulk of my audience for this radio show. And I think we are doing a better job. But, I can't compete with BBC Wales or BBC Scotland on every subject every day. But I think I can probably give you a more enjoyable 3 hours every day than they manage to. But one subject which fascinates me and which we may, if I can find a right way into it, looking at that ScotRail story, things about Scotland that most people in England don't know. And I don't mean, favourite swimming spots and stuff like that. I mean stuff like, as of today, peak time rail fares will be abolished for 6 months right across the ScotRail network, which is a consequence, I think, of, and something else you might not know in England about Scotland, of the Scottish government taking ScotRail into public ownership. The difference between Scotland and England when it comes to NHS industrial action is absolutely enormous. But I don't know that most people in England would be aware of it. So I'm quite keen. The problem with that, I'm doing that thing again where I'm presuming that you have a modicum of interest in the thought processes behind deciding what we talk about on this programme. The problem with my tell us something about Scotland that most people in England won't know idea is that the introduction will involve me telling you quite a lot of things about Scotland that most people in England won't know, at which point the people in England listening to the programme will know about the things in Scotland that most people in England don't know. So there would be very little point ringing in, except to say, I nearly did an accent then, that would have been unfortunate, except to say, except to say, James, you're right, we do have no peak time rail fares for the next 6 months across the network. So I'd love to find a way of doing that. We're not doing it today. Don't clog up my phone lines. But all ideas, all suggestions welcome on how we might do the North-South divide within England, I think we can get across. But the North-South divide as in Scotland versus England, I don't know that I've got the question right yet, so I might need a little bit of help with that. Speaking of the border between Scotland and England, whether historically or not, I can tell you that Gemma Collins has revealed that she spent the entire weekend feeling bad about the felling of the Sycamore Gap, the felling of that tree on Hadrian's Wall, and that is what I believe is known as breaking news. It is 7 minutes after 12. Okay. This is a I don't know quite what word I would use, but this is a story that I really want to talk about. Parents who shout at their children or call them stupid are leaving their offspring at greater risk of self-harm, drug use, and ending up in jail. It's talking harshly to children that should be recognised as a form of abuse, according to some new research published this week. The authors of a new study say adult-to-child perpetration of verbal abuse is characterised by shouting, yelling, denigrating the child, and verbal threats. Now, the research is really interesting, and the correlation between children who were routinely intimidated or shamed or controlled in this way is, I don't know that they can prove causation, but the correlation is clear. And you're talking about low self-esteem, increased nicotine, alcohol and substance use, increased risk of anxiety, depression, even perhaps psychotic disorders. It cites World Health Organization research showing that 36.1% of children worldwide had experienced emotional abuse, which would include verbal abuse, which is more than the 25% who'd suffered sexual abuse or the 22% who'd suffered physical abuse. Now, I don't know that I need to share any more detail of this, except that the paper is called Child Abuse. It's in the journal Child Abuse and Neglect, where the academics write, these types of adult actions can be as damaging to a child's development as other currently recognised and forensically established subtypes of mistreatment, such as childhood physical and sexual abuse. So this is what you would call verbal abuse. And it doesn't just involve, the worst extremes. It would include all sorts of behaviours that are aggressive or violent or loud. Now, why do I love subjects like this to talk about? Answer, because they remind us that we're capable of change. And the reason I know that we're capable of change is because even in the course of doing this job, I would have been on the other side of this argument. I was very, very much of the view that we are... I mean, you probably find this quite hard to believe if you've been listening for the last 5 years or so, or the last 6 or 7 years, and not before. But I very much used to, and I was authentic. I did mean it, even though I was horribly wrong. I was very much of the view that you need to be tougher with children, particularly children with a proclivity for misbehaving. Now, I discovered in therapy how I had ended up in that place, and it's pretty straightforward and a very common therapeutic experience. I was persuading myself that emotional abuse I had endured at my boarding schools hadn't done me any harm. And that's why this is quite a difficult subject to broach on a radio phone-in programme, because a huge number of people persuaded that this is a load of woke nonsense and the only language some children understand is a clip around the ear or, at the very least, a shouted admonishment. They are the people that I used to be. That they are, and you, if I'm describing you, you won't like this and you certainly won't agree with it, but you are persuading yourself that the emotional abuse you suffered was not abuse and that you were fine and that it didn't do you any harm, by insisting that the correct way to treat children is to shout at them or to threaten them or to denigrate them or to call them names. And we build these survival personalities for a reason. This is the bit I haven't quite nailed yet. I've taken my wins and my benefits from therapy and they've changed my life in unimaginable ways. But the bit I haven't really yet got my head around is the knowledge that I needed to do what I did. I needed to build this fake suit of armour. So if you turned on Channel 5 25 years ago, you would have seen a very fresh-faced, beardless me insisting, believe it or not, that corporal punishment was a good thing. That the only language some school children understood was deliberate, formalised, sanctioned violence and physical pain. And I would have said something like... well, as long as it's properly policed and, you can't just let any teacher clatter a child. There has to be a sending it upstairs and only 1 or 2 teachers in the school are sanctioned and you can deliver the child to that teacher to be beaten. And I would sit on television and say, it is... I know it's the only language some children understand because, and I would say this and I would mean it and I believed it in my heart, I would then say, because I was that child. I thought it was such a zinger, Such a zinger, such a killer argument. You got some bleeding heart liberal sitting next to you going, you can't hit children. And I would say, well, I think you'll find that I was hit and it didn't do me any harm. I was beaten regularly as a child and look at me now. Thinking perhaps mistakenly that was somehow proof that beating children was a good thing. But I needed to build that survival personality to get through what I endured at school. And that's the bit I haven't quite reconciled myself to yet. There's a better late than never argument. Most of us who've benefited from therapy will say, especially if it's late in life, will say to our therapist at some point, God, I wish I'd met you 20 years ago. And a good therapist will respond by saying, don't think like that. It's better late than never. And you still had wonderful times in your life and you built wonderful relationships. You're just going to have a better time now. So just focus on how lucky you are to have the future, not how unlucky you are to have elements of your past. Now, I mention that, and I mention it in the context of physical abuse, formal beating, and sometimes informal beating, and also emotional abuse. But I wanted to get the physical in first, because to me, it's the same as the broken leg thing that we mentioned at the very top of the programme. If I say to you, you've got a broken leg, and I say, I don't care, I want you to go and do the 100 metres, you'd rightly think I was an idiot. Now, and similarly, if you say to me, my dad broke my leg when I was a child beating me, I would not respond by saying, oh, don't be silly. You just need to build up a little bit of resilience, pull your socks up and get a stiff upper lip. Whereas if you said to me, my dad broke me emotionally growing up, you're not going to get the same sympathy that you're going to get for physical scars, which is the same conversation, isn't it, from a different angle about physical and mental health in the context of not being able to go to work. So it's really important to remember you just got me there, Ash, and I suspect you knew you were going to. Ash just wrote, this chapter of your book made me approach therapy after a breakdown, James. It always makes me cry. Me too, mate, especially when you ambush me with little messages like that about a small amount of help I might have been able to bring into your life by telling you the story that I've just told you now. It was a huge moment. But as I say, the bit I haven't quite got is the bit about needing to do it at the time. Because if I hadn't done it at the time, I would not have survived. I'd have lived, but I wouldn't have thrived in that toxic environment. I wouldn't have, I won't bore you with the details, but I wouldn't have been what in America they call a big man on campus. And it was well into my 40s that I discovered the damage it had done me. So parents who shout at their children or call them stupid are leaving their offspring at greater risk of self-harm, drug use, and even ending up in jail. But we still live in a country where it wouldn't be hard to find someone who thinks we're too soppy, which are the reason why there's so much misbehaviour is because parents aren't allowed to discipline their children anymore. I don't think you ever need to shout at a child, actually. And I speak as someone who did, but doesn't anymore. I don't think you ever need to, actually. I know we've got the old classics about what if they ran into a road and you had to grab them, or you shout a warning of help, but you do that to an adult. The weirdest thing about all of this stuff is the question of whether you would do it to an adult. So I used to close down the conversations about smacking children by asking men why they didn't smack their wives more. When their wives did things that they didn't like, why don't you smack her? And there aren't really any meaningful responses to that question. You can grope around in the dark and pretend that you're actually teaching your children important lessons when you hit them, but you're not. You're just either failing to control your own emotions or you're subscribing to an outdated and dangerous model of interaction. But when it comes to shouting, I actually think the same. If your children do something that annoys you and you scream at them, chances are you probably do the same with your partner, or you do the same with adults. It's just not helpful. I was a big shouter back in the day. I can't remember the last time I shouted anymore. And that is obviously partly as a consequence of therapy, which not everybody can get and not everybody can afford. So what I want to know from you is how you would explain to a skeptic, and we respect the skeptics. They are not Idiot's Corner applicants, because, well, I was a skeptic once. How would you explain to a skeptic that the adult-to-child perpetration of verbal abuse does deep and lasting harm? And how do you know? You know because you know. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. How would you explain it to a skeptic? Or how do you explain it to yourself? That the adult-to-child perpetration of verbal abuse, I'm quoting the report, does you lasting damage. And it is, and I quote again, characterised by shouting, yelling, denigrating the child, and verbal threats. I'll give you a starter for 10. Hypervigilance. Because the worst thing as a child, I suspect, is getting a completely different reaction for two identical behaviours. And most parents are doing their best. I don't want to make any bones about that. But it's not good enough because we haven't been shown the way. So on a Monday, you do something and your mum or your dad finds it funny. And you do the same thing on a Thursday and they yell at you, which means you're constantly living in a state of fear. It's like an adrenalised fight or flight condition. And it's normal and it's permanent for you. And that is part of the reason why you end up with the problems, some of the problems that are detailed in this research. 18 minutes after 12 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Just to stress, this is specifically about adult-to-child perpetration of verbal abuse. And almost the idea that it is the last taboo, the last bastion of abuse that doesn't get properly labelled, recognised or addressed. Because I really feel for you, man. I really feel for you. If you know the damage that it did, and you have to live with the fact that people either don't believe you or don't buy it, hit the numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 12. James writes, Dilly, I was raised in children's homes and I went to 2 boarding schools. I've been listening to your programme since you started and since before I had children. God, I wish we'd had this conversation long ago. Oh, remember what I said, Dilly. Better late than never, yeah? Better late than never. 22 after 12 is the time. Rachel's in Leeds. Rachel, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hello, sorry.
Hello.
Hi, a bit nervous. Well, it resonates. I had a child of my own a couple of years ago, and it was very triggering. And similar to you, therapy really turned it around. And I really believe that probably more people need it than they realise. And
do you know who needs it? Do you know who needs it most?
Our parents.
Well, no, let's not go there. Got a bit Philip Larkin. No, the people absolutely adamant that they don't need it.
Yeah, agreed.
Which was me for a very long time.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and it made me think of this expression I've picked up along the way, which is that pain that is not transformed is transferred, and
Yes.
It jumps out because I think it's just entrenched in our previous generations, and I think it's so embedded in our culture, in our habits, that we don't really think about why that's the best solution.
Yeah.
And that pain that's not transformed and is transferred is because our parents and their parents and their parents were treated even worse than we were. And it's this...
So when you say triggering, you mean that when you became a parent, you recognised the inappropriateness of some of the things done to you? And we're not talking about... Well, I don't know in your case, but mine was at school rather than at home. But it's not things that were transgressive. It was perfectly accepted conduct a lot of the time. I don't know if that was your experience.
Yeah, I think so. And I think when it's just you and the parent, it's in a bubble and you don't know different. And in my case, it was only ever emotional and mental, but you don't know any better, and you trust the adult. And I think the trigger I'm speaking about is I suddenly went from a very kind of closed-off individual to someone that felt like a child again, and I had to recognise that my instinct on how to treat my child wasn't ideal, and it
because
didn't feel
you would feel like shouting, or you'd feel like and I think it upset my inner child that wasn't treated well. It didn't feel fair to me, and I think the instinct was to shout and make her the problem. But in reality, it was me that had the problem. That's a great way of putting it. And of course, you subconsciously, every time you shout, you're reassuring yourself that it being shouted at didn't do you any harm. Whereas, in fact, until you acknowledge that it did, you're stuck. Yeah. You're stuck forever.
Yeah, agreed. And I think when we shout and we scream and we intimidate and we frighten our children, if it works, it's not because they're turning into healthy, stable children. They're turning into frightened people. And I think that was what my experience was very much. And I with my daughter, want to do better. And when I say better, I don't want her to be afraid of me or hate herself or feel afraid of her partner or put herself in a box because she's too scared to be herself. Because if she's herself, she will be pushed away, shouted at.
Yeah, like properly expressive. And then, I mean, even if it's crying, you can frighten a child into silence and you think that that's worked or you think that that's succeeded, whereas what it's done is just bury something that is going to take decades to come out, if it ever does. Absolutely. So do you feel you're lucky? Because I do. I mean, to have had that. Otherwise, who knows what path you continue going down.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I feel very, very, very fortunate that I was could access therapy for free when I was postnatal, and it transformed my life. And I really don't know where I'd be without it. I had terrible postnatal depression, sort of owe my life to that experience. But while I remember, the other thought that came to mind was all behaviour is communication, and I think we have to look at where children are developmentally. If they can't eloquently express themselves like we can. They cry, they kick, they scream, not because they're bad or because they're trying to manipulate you and make your day harder. It's because it's the only way they know. It's the only access to communication they have. It's our job to show them better ways.
That's really nicely put. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that, but you're absolutely right. Of course it is. It's articulating as opposed to being articulate. Rachel, thank you. As you were speaking, this came in from Will, who's in Tower Hamlets, that I think you'll appreciate. It's a bit of a strange one, this, James. My mum used to shout at me and point at my face, and I thought nothing of it, thinking it was entirely normal. Fast forward to today, and I have an uncontrollable urge to shout and point at our new puppy that we recently adopted whenever he misbehaves. I can't help it. I know it's wrong, but I just can't think rationally during the heat of the moment. I never knew I had this problem until we adopted him, but it's highlighted to me that I need to work on this behaviour before I have children of my own. It really does, actually. 27 after 12 is the time. Faris is in Hammersmith. Faris, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
It's really triggering. I think when you end up having children of your own, as the previous caller mentioned, you kind of end up being in a situation where you're constantly reminded of how you grew up.
Yes.
There's certain words like when you're growing up. I mean, I'm a bit of a stereotype. I went to a boarding school. I've had a lovely upbringing. Amazing parents who are probably listening now. They'd probably be mortified. But, we kind of used the word in our house when we were growing up as like, if I was being helped with homework and stuff, it was like, do you not understand this? Are you stupid? And it's not their fault. It's just the way maybe they were brought up.
It's a good point, and it's an important point. And that's why you say mortified, because this was completely normal.
Yeah, exactly. And then you end up getting older, and then you end up having children of your own potentially, and you end up mimicking certain behaviours. And at the end of the day, fighting fire with fire by shouting, it just doesn't work. It doesn't, no matter how angry or stressed out or upset you are. And from my own experience, it genuinely doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because your children will be so honest with you. So you could spend the day with them, and my eldest will say, I've had an amazing day today, Dad. Oh, what was the best part of your day? Oh, we went to the cinema, we went to the park. Oh, anything you didn't like? Yeah, when you shouted at me because I wasn't brushing my teeth. And then it just makes you like the smallest person on the planet.
Yeah.
And so they are your key determining factors. And I understand where people have concerns and skeptically about these, how can I explain it, about the statistics. Maybe a lot of skeptics are thinking there's no way these kind of incidences are worse than criminal abuse, sexual abuse, child trafficking. I get where they're coming from that respect. But at the end of the day, I think abuse is abuse. And I think we don't talk about it enough. And I think with your previous caller and even yourself, if you're smart enough to try and get some therapy or some help, it's really, it's sobering. But it means that, as you said previously when you started the call, it's not too late to change.
Yeah, always. I mean, that is the single most important lesson out of all of it. And everybody benefits when you do. You're a parent yourself now, I think.
Yeah.
Clearly you are when the children are saying that to you. And you just, it's bizarre. And did you get it right from the start, if you don't mind me asking?
What, in terms of parenting?
Yeah, in terms of shouting.
Oh,
simply.
No, I'm failing and succeeding every day.
Yeah.
It's I think it's the hardest thing I've ever done physically and mentally.
Well,
I completely underestimated it.
Yeah, welcome. It's the same. But what's interesting from what you said at the beginning, that the most hurtful and upsetting words they experience. Now, we might expect some Anglo-Saxon language to come in here or some, traditional pejoratives, but actually the most hurtful and upsetting words that children experienced were, you're useless, you're stupid, and you can't do anything right.
Yeah, that figures.
And the most positive things that I sense you say to your boys a lot were, I am proud of you, you can do it, and I believe in you. And put it like that. And it's the most obvious thing in the world, isn't it? And yet, what do they call it? There's a word for it, isn't there? It's not tough parenting. Isn't there an actual figure of speech for it? Think of all the little figures of speech. Faris, mate, take care. And if your parents have got any problems with what you just said, put them on to me. I think this is really illustrative sometimes. The stuff that we never question. You've got to be cruel to be kind. Oh, you've got to be cruel to be kind. That was almost always said in the context of parenting. You've got to be cruel to be kind. It didn't do me any harm. It flipping did. The louder you say it didn't do me any harm, the louder your inner child is shouting, it really did. It really did. But you've got to be cruel to be kind. What the heck do you think the stiff upper lip is if it's not a socially inculcated instruction to completely ignore your feelings and what's going on inside you. I like this as well. I once asked a school teacher who didn't believe in discipline why he disciplined his dog with a long stick. He replied to keep him under control, and I replied, OK. It's 12:31. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:35. Laura, of course, adds another one to the list. Little children should be seen but not heard. That was, literally policy, wasn't it? Parenting policy, well into the 20th century. I'm going to read some slightly long messages now because some people won't be able to ring in for obvious reasons, and then we'll hit the phones right through until 1 o'clock. I'll start with Chris, who's in Oxford. He says, this item is very affecting, James. As you describe verbal abuse, I can still feel the breath and the deafening shout as the sadistic headmaster of my boarding school yelled in my face over something utterly trivial. I can still feel the blur of tears welling in the eyes of 10-year-old me. I'm now 65. I've had a huge life issue, lifelong fear of authority figures like bosses, and I was diagnosed in January with severe depression, which all obviously goes back to boarding school, where I learned to shut down my feelings and felt elated when I no longer felt homesick. This is similarly powerful. James, I really want to call, but I can't talk through my tears right now. Your last segment on mental abuse opened up old wounds that I've been part suffering and part burying for decades. My mum was, actually still is, emotionally abusive, and I think I can now attribute that to my depression and the anorexia that I've lived with since I was 15. It's constant fear, threat, the feeling of being unsafe, of never being good enough. She still controls me. I behave like the child I was who she abused. I like to think I'm breaking the cycle now with my own children. My mum calls me weak and soft and says I'm making a rod for my own back. But, well, they're my rods and my back. I'm a fully paid up member of the Gentle Parenting Brigade, and I won't allow any shouting, denigration, mockery, nothing. I set clear boundaries, but we discuss and I listen. I don't know if I get it right all the time, but they are emotionally very open and will share with me how they're feeling, what upsets them, and they are very empathetic to others too. There it is, breaking the cycle, breaking that generational cycle. And another one, if you'd allow, and you'll see why I want to share this one. It's not signed. James, I was shouted at and called thick or stupid by my dad all the time as a child and teenager for not being good at maths. I probably have an undiagnosed problem with numbers, as I still find even playing cards confusing. I was also given a clip round the ear very often. I ducked every time he walked behind me. I was never beaten, but it's made me very anxious and feeling very low self-worth. So even if you don't buy the bits about addiction and other behaviours, the bits about self-esteem are so clear, aren't they? So obvious. Back to the phones. Kelly's in Lambeth. Kelly, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Basically, most people have said what I more or less wanted to voice, but I'll say in my experience. I was telling your researcher throughout the lockdowns, I actually invested most of my my savings into 3 forms of therapy: hypnotherapy, psychotherapy, and EMDR, because it got to a point where I had such low self-esteem that I was thinking of getting myself out of this life. Okay. A lot of people don't understand why anyone would think like that. I fully knew it came from my childhood. My mother was one of those nothing's good enough sort of thing. Yeah. I do everything wrong. I'm rude. I'm the problem. I did what a child would do, just be a child, but everything was my fault, including her problems. Obviously, now growing up and doing my own research, psychological research, she was projecting what she hated in herself and me. But when you're not aware of that, you just sort of get on with life thinking you are the problem and trying to be as perfect as possible for everybody else, when in reality you're just being you, and you're not going to be able to satisfy anyone, including that parent that is now you're an adult. So obviously you just get on with life and everyone else thinks there's something wrong with you as well as you. It becomes very difficult for you to understand that unless you have to look at your parents honestly and realize, as much as your parents are your parents and you love them, there is a possibility you don't like them and they were cruel and abusive towards you. A lot of times parents are the ones that needed to develop first before they had kids.
Yes, I guess so. And it doesn't have to be conscious. I think that's what probably most people who approach this conversation from a position of confusion or skepticism will be most taking away, is that parents who thought that they would, projection aside, who if you'd actually given them a truth serum, they wouldn't have thought they were doing you harm. They would have thought that they were doing you good while they did you terrible harm.
Well, a lot of time I feel as though they justify it because if they actually have to, well, this is what my EMDR therapist taught me. A lot of times, mothers particularly, if they actually have to look at themselves and say, I was a terrible mother, it's something so unnatural to do that because they actually have to admit, I was bad, which means you have to make atonement and make things right. And a lot of times, even your ego won't let you do that, particularly parents of my mother's time. She's in her 60s, that obviously parents do no wrong. I'm a child, I'm to be seen and not heard. I have no knowledge, I'm dumb. I'm just here to be, and that's it.
Is EMDR a bit like brain spotting? Is that when you move your eyes across?
That one, yes.
Oh, I'm fascinated by that. And
it basically desensitizes you towards the memory, just becomes a memory rather with an emotion attached to it. It's very good. I recommend it to everyone.
It does sound absolutely fascinating. And how have you changed as a consequence of undergoing these therapies?
I've actually learned to actually love myself and accept myself, along with subliminal messages that I was recording and listening throughout the night so that my brain would actually absorb it into my mind. And I've realised I have worth. I don't have to get involved with people that are familiar to my mum's treatment in order to break that cycle.
So what were you doing? How was the cycle? How did it? If you don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but what sort of behaviours were you doing that you don't do now because you've learnt that?
I would put up with people's crap.
Yeah.
I would put up with people mistreating me. I'd think it was my fault. If people had a problem with me, I must have done something wrong. So I'd go home and have to analyse what I did, hypervigilance, as you said, and see what it is that I was doing wrong. And then most of the time I didn't do anything wrong. And I'm a human. I have flaws and they're permissible. But trying to be perfect is always going to cause you problems because you will never be perfect for anyone.
That's probably the killer bit, isn't it? Is it for what you've described? It's very different from my experience, but that self-knowledge, self-care,
self-awareness,
self-awareness, and what's it done? Again, you don't have to tell me. What's it done to your relationship with your mum?
She won't change. She becomes defensive.
But you can't change her. That's one of the things we learn, isn't it? Or you can only change yourself, and then I hopefully you can change the way people respond to you. But that's not happened here.
I feel as though parents have such a strong hold over you that in my case, I just have to keep her away. Because she still does stuff that I think, but you're so much older, how can you not be wiser? She still does things that is like, okay, no, I have to keep away from you.
Well, then you've got to prioritise your own health and well-being over anything else like that. Thank you, Kelly. It's incredible stuff. I should stress I'm lucky in one sense because at home was always very, very safe for me, very happy. But that's why so many people who get in touch on conversations like this are boarding school survivors, but equally you could have had a terrible time at home and boarding school would be a refuge. I've got a couple of friends who've been in touch since I wrote my last book to tell me they had the opposite experience, and we of course had no idea at the time how awful their home lives were. Barbara in York writes, my mother was always telling me that she was ashamed of me and she used to threaten with sending me to a children's home if I didn't behave. That's my most abiding memory of her. No wonder I've had low self-esteem for my entire life. There's so much going on, isn't there, that you don't notice until someone takes the time to notice. Mia is in Cardiff. Mia, what would you like to say?
Hiya.
Hello.
So my relationship with my stepdad now is fantastic. I've been through a lot of therapy, and recent big family trauma of mine has kind of brought the family around me, and he's stepped up and he's told me how sorry he is and he sees it, so that's all good.
Yes.
But actually, like, the behaviour, like, he was my stepdad from the age of 2.
Right.
My dad didn't, I know my dad, we all live around the corner from each other.
Okay.
But he wasn't in my life for a very long time. So I had an absent dad, and I had my stepdad, and all I ever wanted was just love and acceptance, and that seemed to be exactly what he couldn't give me.
Was he a shouter?
Yeah, he was, like, all the family knew, like, he was a harsh man.
Yeah.
With a short fuse. But oh my God, did he adore my mother? And I always saw that, you know.
And that's a huge saving grace, really, in your.
Yeah.
But it's a lot for you to take on board as a child.
I felt like a spare part that wasn't wanted around by anyone.
Gosh.
Apart from my mum, she was wonderful, but I took a grievance with the fact that she allowed my stepdad to be the way he was.
Yes.
I just always thought it was just like cruel behaviour. As like your last caller really rang true with me. It's just like, you were just being a kid, and I've got a baby of my own now, and they like she's baby, but I have friends who have kids, and they're just kids. Like, I always thought I was just being a kid, and I always knew how he treated me wasn't nice and wasn't quite right.
I don't want to run out of time. What changed? How did you turn it into this? Don't apologise to me. It's my fault. I'm supposed to be the professional here, man. How did it change? How have you reached a place where you've come to a better understanding? He's changed how he behaves, presumably, and you've come to a better understanding of why he did behave like he used to behave. Yeah,
basically. If the first part was me going to therapy and seeing him as a person and a human being who has their own flaws and own issues and own traumas, and I did a lot of work with being a child and ideal parenting and stuff like that. And then my partner passed away very suddenly when I was pregnant. Oh. And that's the thing that happened in the family. Right. And he just really stepped up. And I don't know, as he's gotten a bit older, I think he's just calmed down a bit. Maybe he doesn't feel as much pressure on him. Yeah. We always joke that a vasectomy maybe had something to do with it. But like, he's a lot lighter now, and I think he's learned from what happened with Phil that he just needed to be kinder and more appreciative. And
I suppose he asked himself, because he cared for you even when he wasn't looking after you, but in the way. And he reached a point where he had to ask himself what he can do to help you best.
I think he was just recognising that his behaviour wasn't okay. Like you said, I don't think he ever meant me harm, but he was a young man with a stepchild, and I don't know what else maybe was going on, but if he just looked at his behaviour and was like, I'm really sorry, and I love you, and I should have shown you better. And
he reached that on his own. I mean, with the trauma that the family experienced and your terrible bereavement, but he managed to kind of clock it and change it himself. Thank you, Mia. It's 12:48. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Sort of the damage done by what we would call verbal abuse. How so there'll be I can tell from my inbox actually, which is very moving. An awful lot of people have felt pennies drop in the course of the last 48 minutes. Like the sense of, particularly on self-esteem. And if you've got really low self-esteem, I think that Kelly nailed this particularly. You can end up in unhealthy relationships because you don't think you deserve better because you've got such low self-esteem, and that then leads to substance abuse and all sorts of other issues, and that can lead to criminality. So when you read that this kind of stuff leads to low self-esteem, increased nicotine, alcohol and substance abuse, increased risk of anxiety, depression and even psychotic disorders, you begin the conversation from a position of, really? That seems like quite a leap. And now, of course, it makes perfect sense. It's 12:48.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:52 is the time. On Friday we ended the show with a Philip Larkin poem, didn't we? And there is a rather obviously pertinent poem by Philip Larkin that could be shared at the end of this hour as well. This Be the Verse it's called, but it contains at least two words, well, the repetition of one word that I certainly can't repeat live on the radio, but you're probably familiar with it. If you're not, just substitute the word mess for the more obvious one. It says they mess you up, your mum and dad. Although in my case, boarding school teachers as opposed to parents. The other way around for Mustafa, who writes, my father used to yell at me so much that I would voluntarily wet the bed when I was 10 to avoid having him yell at me for being up when I got up to go to the toilet. Oh, mate. I then involuntarily wet the bed from the age of 13 until 20. I'm so conscious. Even walking through my office to my seat makes me anxious. So Mustafa desperately trying not to draw any attention to himself, because whenever he attracted his dad's attention, he would get screamed at, he would get yelled at. And it's frightening. Noise is frightening. Little things, big noises. Just think about it. You still jump sometimes when someone takes you by surprise or when a car backfires up the road. You do that on purpose, right into the face of a tiny human. 12:53 is the time. Jake's in Bristol. Jake, what would you like to say?
Good morning. Well, what I've been through is very much about shame. Both my parents had their issues. My father was an alcoholic and my mother was is narcissistic. And with that, on my father's side, there was a lot of explosive reactions from him, which were completely unjustified for the situation.
Because he's completely unregulated. So you can't know from one day to the next what reaction you're going to get for the same behaviour, which is just maddening for a child.
Yeah, on my mother's side, though, she was very, very controlling. There was always an agenda. And because she lacked empathy, she had an idea of what I was going to become. And I had to forego what I wanted, my curiosity for things, with compliance. And with that grew an obsession to prove myself. I always had to try and gain her acceptance with everything. But if it didn't meet with what she wanted, then there would always be criticism and judgment because it's not what she wanted me to be. And growing up with this, my whole internal thought process it's a bit like being in a courtroom and, being in the dock, and I'm always having to defend myself. I'm always feeling guilty, always feeling that shame because what they call the inner child part of me has been the part I've had to exile. And with that, I've had to create this protector who's always justifying, arguing, defending, explaining, catastrophizing and criticizing. And, with that, that's become my armor and it's become my standard mode of thought. And it's only been in the recent years where, things were getting so bad that I was really feeling like I needed to end it all, where I managed to get into some therapy and I've been able to start seeing all of this. I'm far from mended, if there ever is that, but I'm starting to see it all now and appreciate, with what they call the self, the calm adult part of me. I'm getting perspective over these actions and behaviours, and with it, it's it's starting to give me enough perspective that I don't always keep jumping into the first thought in my head where I need to justify.
I know exactly what you're describing.
Exactly, to protect that, shame part of me. I'm
so
starting
don't go
to
there.
allow...
So lash out, win the fight. Someone criticises you even mildly, just leave them bleeding in a metaphorical puddle on the floor because that is preferable to having a look inside.
Well, the biggest part is, I've had to do it in myself, but also now I can see it in other people.
Yeah.
It's, recognizing the difference between the person and their behavior. We've all learnt these behaviors through defenses from our past, which have been then our parents' past. It's intergenerational trauma, basically. And with that, it's been really, really important to be able to separate the two. Whereas before, I was just interlocked between, myself and the other person and our behaviours. And, their behaviour that was, similar to my behaviour would then, literally interlock. And then that would be it in my mind. I'd be constantly pre-scripting, role-playing, trying to create the best, comeback and, sort of retaliation.
I do know. How in obvious ways, how has your life outside the therapy room improved, if you see what I mean? You've hinted at it already.
It's getting there, but it's still very hard because a lot of people around me, I spent a number of years away from where I lived to get some perspective over it all, but I've come back now because I realise that also what I love is here, sort of what I used to do, the passion and the true part of me, basically, the part that's been exiled. And, with it, though, I still see so many people who now look at me because I've been branded as being a bit crazy and a bit this, a bit that, by my family because they're so stuck in their defences that they have to be perfect. They have to, show no weakness. And, because I have opened myself up to it, I've then been, what they call the scapegoat in the family. I'm the one with all the problems.
And you become a receptacle for, or the object of projection. Jake, take care, mate, and good luck with the work. It sounds like it is. Well, it is obviously having an effect, but I don't know that it ever ends, actually. I don't know that it's ever over. and I can't possibly read this out because it identifies a sort of semi-public figure, but I'll read out. It's probably not relevant, James, but I do recall some years ago seeing a gentleman totally losing it and shouting at his son in the street. It was over some sweets or something the kid wanted or something like that. It's the closest I've ever come to intervening in an incident like that, but I didn't. And the man and his children continued on their way. His wife followed, looking rather sheepish. The man was sort of having an adult tantrum in the street. It was in Hay and Wye during the Hay Festival. The weird thing is that later that day I saw the same man talking on the TV. It wasn't Rebecca Vardy's account, but I appreciate that there's an air of a cliffhanger to that. I know the person you're talking about, and I find your story supremely easy to believe. That is it from me for another day. We'll do it all again tomorrow morning from 10. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, Rewind Live Radio, or enjoy the whole show podcast. Amazing full disclosure this week with Naomi Klein, which you can also find via Global Player, as well as all of LBC's shows to catch up on and the best video clips from across LBC and all our other global stations. So Rewind Live Radio on Global Player. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. In fact, if you want to find a little more about some of the subjects we've been discussing this hour, the full disclosure episode with Gabor Mate would be particularly good as well. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it is Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.